set it off because, as I'll now explain to colleagues, this is, as now is standard with all panel meetings and with the LEP board meeting and so on, this is a public meeting, and the way it's rendered public, and I think it's a very good move in terms of transparency, is to both record it, but also live stream it via, I think, a YouTube channel that anybody can log on to. So from a transparency point of view, it's great, really good, because it cuts the geography out of it and pretty much means that anybody can view what's going on, which is exactly how it should be. So I certainly welcome that. But important that everybody's aware that that's the case. We're not excluding any matters in this meeting, and whilst this is our first public meeting for some time, given the obvious circumstances, this comment is primarily for the benefit of anybody who has chosen to tune in, as it were, via YouTube. We have been seeking to progress a number of agenda items through working groups and other sessions, despite the strictures of the COVID-19 situation. So glad we're here. Hope everybody's well. We've done so many of these meetings in our various parts of life, I'm sure, that I don't really need to rehearse the etiquette of it. But the key points are that when we're in session working through, we would ask that people just keep their cameras off until we get into the discussion phase. Also, obviously, mute yourselves. The presenter will presenters, depending whether it's singular or plural, will keep their cameras on, and by all means, you can sort of physically indicate that you want to come in to the discussion with a wave or some other obvious symbol, or alternatively, just use the chat function. And the chat function is really best used during the presentation. So both myself and Jackie will do our very best to keep our eye on it as the presentations are being given, the papers are being talked through in anticipation of the discussion section. It really helps me if you do sort of telegraph the fact that you want to ask something or that you have a point via the chat, because what it allows me to do is aggregate those up and then lead the conversation off by bringing different themes forwards for the presenter or for others who may be present. So please do use it if you feel that you want to contribute in that respect. So in terms of apologies, we were talking about it just a moment ago, but we have apologies from Alice, and we have and from potentially from Martin Farrington, and we have a likely apology or delayed arrival from William Firth and from Wallace Sampson. So in terms of the minutes relate to those working groups and the sessions that we've held since, gosh, when was it, Jackie? October, I think, wasn't it, last year? So the last sort of formal minutes applied to October last year. So whilst we have minutes, what we don't have is any outstanding actions there. And again, for the benefit of those who are joining us from outside of the panel, there has been progress made, but it's not been through a formal meeting of this nature until today. So mindful of time and aware that we have a number of really important, it's a relatively limited agenda, but each of the agenda items is really important and quite complex. And I think it's key that we give enough time as possible to some of the discussion areas. So I think we'll start off really just inviting Guy. I'm looking, I can't see. Oh yes, you are here. You are with us, Guy. That's great. So, Guy, if you're happy to take things from here, if you want to lead off, and Guy's going to share with us a really important report and paper around the White Rose Forest Plan and the Nature for Climate Fund, and of course, as we'll be discussing all manner of emission reduction pathways and climate mitigation measures later, they are really key building. So, Guy, I can hand over to you.
Sure. Okay. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. I thought it'd be a good idea just to have an interim report. I've been threatening to come to this meeting for a couple of years, but there's been some interesting developments, and I really thought that it'd be worthwhile understanding where we're up to with the White Rose Forest Plan, and also the Nature for Climate Fund. So I'm just going to work through the paper fairly systematically. First thing, obviously, to reiterate that the White Rose Forest Plan is a named action in your green and blue infrastructure strategy, basically to work out how we want to increase tree cover and the best way of doing that. So that's been taking shape over the last few years. And I wanted to kind of just give you a flavour of it. We're not going to say where we're going to plant trees and where we're not going to plant trees. It's more about understanding the delivery pathway process, starting off with coordinated landowner engagement. So we will say there are some areas that have more benefits than others, and this is the landowners we would like to have a conversation with. So we're not telling landowners that we're going to plant on their land, but saying we're really, really interested, and if they are, pick up the phone. Once we've got a committed landowner, an interested landowner, our next focus is on multidisciplinary design. This isn't just about sticking trees in the landscape. This is about working out what's needed for that particular site or landscape and making sure we get the most out of it. Actually, to put together widen the amount of funding and delivery partners involved. And I'll talk about the funding a little bit later. That's our broad, in a nutshell, our broad approach. There are two basic programs. Landscapes for Water, which is essentially rural, catchment based. It's looking at the driver is reducing flooding. And looking at the White Rose Forest geography, the three main catchments are the Aire, the Calder, and what is called the Suno catchment. The reason why the Suno catchment has joined the list is because very recently York City Council joined up to the White Rose Forest and were very keen to have a landscapes for water project that affected their city. And of course that means that we're going to the swell Nidanews, and they've talked to North Yorkshire County Council, who have agreed to join up to the White Rose Forest joint venture. So that's the third catchment priority for us. The second programme is Green Streets, which is essentially about linking areas of deprivation to areas of jobs growth through primary transport corridors. It has more of an urban focus. So that's the basic structure of the plan. The local nature partnership and the directors of development made it quite clear that the plan had to have clear and measurable targets. The first one obviously is about increasing tree cover. We've actually measured that. It's 11.2%, and there's 12 million trees in the current Leeds City region, and we will be extending that blue sky analysis across North Yorkshire in the next few weeks and months. But for the Leeds City region, it's currently 11.2%. So then the question is, well, what do you want to increase it to? Can you increase it to? Is there the land, let alone the interest and all the rest of it? So we've set up a White Rose Forest Carbon Group. It's chaired by Leeds City Council. It's got a number of carbon experts, and they are national quality carbon experts from the Woodlands Trust, Forestry Commission, and the University of Leeds, to put together a carbon-led planting strategy that will help the White Rose Forest be able to go to each district and say, this is what we think is possible potential in the landscape. And so they can come up with a range of what they would like to see in their local authority for 2050. We expect the result of that study and the analysis and the local analysis required to translate that work, because it's a bit complicated to say the least, it's above my IQ level, but we expect about September 2020. So speaking with partners currently, particularly the landowner ones, we think at the moment over the next 5 years, we think there'll be about 2,500 hectares of new woodland created. That's the potential given existing landowner interest. We also need to measure other targets, particularly because we're obviously a community forest and therefore looking at the wider benefits. So it isn't just about planting trees and increasing tree cover. We obviously want to be able to measure biodiversity. We want to measure where sites have got a flood impact. where we can, through design and location, we can improve air quality. And we want to measure accessible woodlands, the increase in them, especially where they are, so we can hit the woodland access standard. And we want to measure community engagement. Now, well, that's about information management. It's quite complicated, so that would require a GIS resource, which I'll come to a bit later. There is an issue with biodiversity net gain. At the moment, it's currently skewed against planting of trees. The Forestry Commission nationally are aware of that and are looking to try and recalibrate it with their colleagues in Natural England. If we can use biodiversity net gain as a measurement, we will. If not, we'll have to perhaps just use a spatial measurement for the benefits we derive. So just thought on 2.4, just look at some highlights. First of all, hopefully you're all aware of the Leeds Fast 2 Natural Flood Management Programme in the Upper Air. This work's been going on for a few years now. Just to say that we are linked into that. COVID-19's delayed the contract with the Environment Agency, but the process of landowner engagement, design and all that sort of stuff is very much in that. But more than that, I think, the resources that have gone into it, I think it's from Leeds City Council originally, but it's managed by the Environment Agency. Really, this is a bit of a showcase, not just for us, but for the Northern Forest and even nationally. So that's a really one to keep an eye on, I think. The number two, the climate emergencies have had a real impact politically, certainly, and in Kirklees Council's responded to that. So for 20 years, I've been the lone coordinator for the White Rose Forest joint venture. Last year I had somebody from the Community Forest Trust join me, but Kirklees have offered 2 further project managers responding to specific needs that we've got. One is GIS, which I mentioned earlier. It's about recording woodland increase, but also actually managing sites through the delivery pathway. And an external relationships manager to look at the website and reach out to businesses and communities so they can join our campaign, which we've called Trees for Yorkshire. Just a couple of highlight changes in the White Rose Forest structure. 2017, the Directors of Development gave go ahead for each local authority district to set up a White Rose Forest group to help steer the local response. That's now all underway. And now representatives of all those groups now meet together as a group. They've just met the once. They would have met twice. They would have met this week, actually. But obviously COVID-19's delayed that. But that's very, very helpful. That's chaired by Leeds City Council again. That's Polly Cook. And the idea is to bring all the district leads together in one room. And that you can really tell that's going to really move this plan forward, certainly politically, I believe. The other one group, which is the third phase of the delivery pathway, which is the White Rose Forest Funders Group. This is essentially all the organisations that fund trees and woodlands, Forestry Commission, Woodlands Trust, Environment Agency, got the combined authority on it. It's basically bring them into one room and to make sure that once sites have been well designed, we allocate the right funding package to the right scheme. That's easier said than done, but it's essential we're doing that because funders will compete unnecessarily and it make a very confusing picture for landowners. So the spine of the plan, essentially the White Rose Forest delivery pathway, is to try and take from an expressions of interest, build up the pipeline, and if landowners and partners want information or help on design or in funding packages, we're there to support them. If not, we're still there just to record all the activity. Now, the change of the plan, we've got to means the governance has got to change. So we've set up a White Rose Forest governance group to look at how we might make decisions management more effectively, as well as actually change the government documents. Now we've got North Yorkshire County Council minded to join, then it's important that the structures reflect that new wider area and that decisions are made properly. So that's ongoing and working in parallel. Similar sort of processes happen with the Northern Forest. We've been fighting to make sure that the community forestry, which is the basis of the Northern Forest, as was originally when it was first conceived, is very much stays there, and welcome the Director of Development support for making sure that the White Rose Forest continues to be at the top table of the Northern Forest. We set up a Northern Forest Operations Group to make sure the best practice is brought together. Okay, on 2.7, the bit that everybody likes is the funding side. In a nutshell, March 11th, 2020, the budget, Nature for Climate, £640 million was allocated to increase tree cover by 30,000 hectares. That's not enough, according to the Committee for Climate Change, but it's a real ramping up of activity, so it's heading in the right direction. Now, nothing has been approved. There's quite a complicated programme, and nothing's going to happen until Treasury sign it off, we think in October, all being well. But we, as White Rose Forest and Haywoods in Hull and East Yorkshire, have put together a consortium bid with England's Community Forest Network with a view of trying to bring in some funding for at least 1,500 hectares for North and West Yorkshire. We don't know whether it's going to happen or not. Everybody says it's looking good, but until it's in the bank, we're not going to pop open the champagne. Encouragingly, though, that said, DEFRA have got some allocation of money they don't need Treasury funding for. So they've allocated £2.5 million to the Community Forest Network to get the pipeline underway. And I managed to sort of jump up and down and say Yorkshire's a very big place. We need lots of boots on the ground. And I believe that £727,000 is on its way to Kirklees Council as the accountable body. And that will basically be used to pump prime the boots on the ground to get the delivery pathway and the pipeline in some sort of shape. And also help to do things like expand the carbon study to North Yorkshire and boost where we've got landowner interest to make sure they've got the capacity to turn those interests into sites. But obviously the big one is whether we get the capital funding between 2020 and 2025. If we do, and we are given 1,500 hectares, that figure will be about 25 million. On 3.1, just to say that 30th of June, Cabinet didn't take place. We're not for our item. It's going to be on the 13th of July. And that's just making sure that Kirklees I've got some key decision notices to accept the responsibility as being an accountable body. It's very, I think it should be straightforward. There's a lot of portfolio support. Okay, I think that's pretty much what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Guy. That's great. Thank you. We've got about 10 minutes or so for questions. Just if we keep into time, probably let it drift on a little bit longer than that, given it's obviously a really important area of focus. I think we are expecting a summary of the White Rose Forest plan around autumn of this year. Is that right, Guy?
Ideally, yes. So assuming that the district groups and the carbon study can come up with some meaningful figures, then we should have a good draft plan by the autumn. And I'd like to come back and sort of give the detail on that. We're aiming to get the whole thing signed off by December 2020, ideally. And then the joint venture would then be revised in the new year. Obviously, COVID has slowed things up.
Yeah.
But yes, that's the target. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, great. So with that in mind, there are three questions that have come, or observations that have come via the chat. So I think what I will do is invite you to address the first two. So, and then after that, invite Scott to come and ask his own question, because I'm not entirely sure I'd do your question justice, Scott, if that's all right. So perhaps if we ask Guy to address the point around how the work is going to link in with the ICAS programme and the EA work that may measure the impact on flood defence. And there's another, one might argue, almost sort of resilience related, albeit in the context of climate resilience, question that's come in from Ben, relating to species choice and the way in which the forest will be planted out, and how that may anticipate, or how that will anticipate, various climate scenarios, and so that it's resilient to different climatic well, outcomes, I guess, in terms of the change that's already baked in. Some examples provided by Ben in his question. So perhaps if you could weave those two together, because they are
okay
related. And then perhaps also we'll give a little bit of space for Rosa, who's with us here from the EA, to perhaps come back in a little bit on the EA sort of linkage as well, if that feels appropriate to you, Rosa. And then once we've had that discussion, invite Scott to come in and ask his question himself. I've got a thumbs up from Rosa, so that's super. Thanks, Rosa.
Okay, so the ICAS program, they are aware. So this part of the plan would be under landscapes for water, and as I said, our three main catchments are the Aire, the Calder, and the large Suno catchment. We haven't set the Suno catchment group up yet, but the one in the Aire and the activity in the Calder catchment are very much linked to EA officers and the work there, particularly obviously the Aire catchment. So each White Rose Forest group is meant to have direct link or have attendance by their flood manager. That's meant to be a part of the makeup of each council's White Rose Forest group. And I think that's generally the case, actually. So the EA should be aware. And when it comes to local planning of priority sites, any modelling that's been done is very much linked to the information we have. In fact, the Landscapes for Water is based on an EA data set called Woodlands for Water. So I think that there is awareness there.
Great.
Yeah, I think on that one.
Do you want to touch on the sort of the species selection and the way in which that the forest can anticipate future climate scenarios? I garbled the question earlier.
Yeah, no, it's a very difficult one. So yes, the core woodland species mix would be native, but we've got to look at resilient forestry. So therefore, looking at a wider variety of species. We find sometimes that non-native trees grow a lot better than native trees. So it's really about thinking about the design. Now, in terms of extremes, I'm not too worried about the drought one so much because of the increasing in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It means that plants don't have to open their stomata so much, so they lose less water trying to get CO2 in. But I think in terms of weather extremes, I think it's a case of building in quite dense planting and making sure that you've got protective nurse species from a wide range of non-natives, which may not be native to our island, but they certainly do work. So you reduce the wind exposure and stuff like that. And the other one, which people don't really think about when they think about trying to create a native woodland, is to try and improve the soil. And that obviously improves for water flow and all the rest of it. So the use of non-natives is important to improve the soil so the natives can grow better.
I think that's a really important point, and I'd like to invite Rosa to come in a moment, but probably worth noting, Jackie, that when we come back around this, whether it's in autumn or a bit later, depending on how it plays through for you, Guy, touching on soil health as an agenda, not just around the forest, but more broadly, I think would be a valuable topic to have even briefly on the agenda. I mean, clearly it's a very significant resilience point. Rhoda, do you want to come in here, and then we'll switch over to Scott for him to ask his question directly. And then I'm noticing also that Melanie Teller from NGN's asking about the potential for the private sector to help in delivering the plan and how different types of partnerships might evolve. So, given that Scott's question relates to landowner engagement and other types of dynamics of that nature, perhaps we'll go to Scott via Rosa, and once that discussion's been had, perhaps pick up that wider sort of participation and collaboration piece with the private sector, if that's okay.
Thanks, Simon. So I guess that just the main thing I'd like to say is well done, Guy, for your dedication on this for the last 20 years, and for being able to step up and seize the moment as the interest has really peaked. There are clearly there is a lot of interest at a Yorkshire scale and beyond on carbon sequestration and the possibility of creating new, I don't know, investment vehicles, for want of a better way of describing it, that helps us sort of fund tree planting and indeed nature-based solutions more broadly, and maintain them over a sustained period of time. So that's just I guess a share of something that we're working on. What else would I like to say? The landowner engagement work, trying to make a segue for you, Scott, that we're doing on the air is very, I think it takes on board a lot of the learning from White Rose Forest over the years about how to work with the smaller community forest groups and the experts within them who are part of the communities that we are seeking to do the planting in. So really trying to take that, pardon the phrase, but the grassroots approach to that engagement, but recognising the need to sort of bolster that that capacity to be able to step up to the challenge, and that's one of the main things that I would see that we've got to collectively watch, is being able to build capacity in this sector. So bringing it back round to Green Economy Panel and sort of Lead City Region strategic work, there are a large number of skills in responding to the climate emergency that we need to consider, and forestry is a key part of that. Land management, soil expertise are all up there, along with low carbon technology jobs and things that we need to be thinking about. So that's it from me, Simon. Sorry, a little less structured than I'd intended, but hopefully helpful. So I'll hand over to Scott.
No, that's great as always. Thanks, Rosa. Scott, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, thanks for the way. Don't worry, mine's going to be no less unstructured. Yeah, I guess let me just go back to the messages, because that's where my chat thing was. So yeah, I just wanted to touch on, I guess, some of the difficulties between thinking of that land management and the sort of whole catchment plan that doubtless a lot of our local authorities need, especially when we're thinking about flood management and such. I guess part of the difficulty, what I'm going to be a bit anecdotal here, but I'm sure it's not distinct to Calderdale, for example, is when some tree planting schemes, specifically things like Clough Woodland and smaller schemes like that, have been put forward. There's been a bit of a conflict between ecological reports and I guess the sort of idea to sort of skew away from it when there's been a bit of a conflict between what's considered an invasive amount of trees versus what we've got going on in terms of wildlife, so native species or whatever. So I'm just wondering what that interaction between your group and ecological officers who are doing their reports looks like, because I guess my question is, where's the scrutiny of their reports, and what does that interaction between your ideas for tree planting and where they should be go towards, really? I think I'm thinking as well about groups like Moors to the Future as well, who you know are doing equally good work, carbon sequestration, but in terms of moorland and sphagnum moss and similar. So yeah, like I said, as unstructured as Rosa, but there's points in there somewhere.
That's great, and I guess there's a trade-off point there in general, isn't there, Scott? A lot of the conversations that we're having now are going to be having in the future are around trade-offs between different agendas that may have legitimacy in their own right, but they come into potential conflict with each other. Guy, can I sort of hand that over to you then?
Yeah, no, sure. So the multidisciplinary design approach means that from basic forestry practices, if you're trained as a forester, which I'm not, but the foresters that we use, they're part of their degree is about understanding biodiversity as well as access and water. So no forester or forestry design group would not want to start by getting all the current ecological information that exists, and we try to demonstrate that in the Gorpy Reservoir project, which was meant to be showing how the multidisciplinary design approach works. I mean, we got absolutely every single bit of information we possibly could. We had the RSPB on site. There was record from 2006 showing where there were twite nesting. Now they were no longer there, but we said, okay, for the sake of the design, let's pretend they are. And how would that change where you put trees and all the rest of it? So out of the 160 hectares, I think about 50 to 60 were planted with trees, 50, 60 peat, and the rest of it's open like heathland. And that's purely through a design process using that information. But culturally, if we just step back and got out of the weeds a little bit, essentially there are two approaches. One, you say there's the precaution principle, if they don't plant trees. The other one is to say, let's have a presumption to plant, but by doing appropriate design measures, we'll make sure that the trees are put in the right place. And that really is a national conversation, really, and it's a DEFRA-based conversation between the Forestry Commission, the EA, and Natural England about where that balance goes. And we're saying, if you're taking carbon sequestration seriously, if you really believe it's important, then you've got to have the presumption to plant, but make sure the design processes are in place. You can't go on by precautionary principle.
So can I just come in there with two additional points? So the first is that as part of the Northern Forest collaboration and DEFRA supporting that, DEFRA chair a facilitation group which brings together Environment Agency, Forestry Commission and Natural England. And the purpose of that group is to understand some of those strategic issues and where there is systemic procedural issues, just help get rid of them and overcome them. To be able to accelerate delivery of the Northern Forest. That's the core purpose of that group. And I think as the Northern Forest forms itself as a solid partnership, like so evolving from a concept and a coalition of the community forest and becomes a more formal structure, that facilitation group will continue to exist. And for Yorkshire EA, I am a member of that group. The other thing, oh no, it's gone. Zoom stage fright. What's the other thing I wanted to say? No, it's totally gone. I'll just have to pause. Complete brain block. Apologies, okay, guys. Oh no, it's come back. It's come back. Excellent. It's Councillor Waller talking about the link with ICAS and so on. It's made me think that there is it's just to flag to you, Guy, really in particular, but for the panel's awareness as well, that the Yorkshire Flood and Coastal Committee, that Councillor Waller is also a long-standing member of, that Flood and Coastal Committee, it has an environment subgroup in it, and that group is looking at how it can work collaboratively with partners like the White Rose Forest and others, and what it needs to do to be able to do that in terms of bringing together that nature, the natural flood management aspect of nature-based solutions. So that is something that will come forward over the next few months and should be helpful. I don't know whether, Andrew, you're more cited on that than me at the moment, if you wanted to say anything else on that, but it's an important link to make, I think.
That's great. Thanks, Rosa. So just mindful of time, we've got quite a lot to get through, but there's an outstanding question here from Mel Taylor in relation to the way in which the private sector, I guess there's a very broad range of what the private sector represents, from those that have huge land holdings and assets and the ability to exert true influence, through those who might be more sort of allies and supporters, but without the direct hands-on ability to create that influence. But perhaps if you could take her question to you and then just broaden it out a little bit so that the panel as a whole can understand how this project might interact with the different sectors that colleagues represent or are engaged with, Guy? And I guess, how can you help us help you, sort of thing, is the question that sits behind that. And then once we've heard from Guy, we'll wrap this item up and move on to the next agenda item.
Okay, firstly to say, when the White Rose Forest strategy was launched in August 1st, 2000, it was about attracting and retaining business investment into West Yorkshire. So that side of the benefits of trees and woodlands has always been in the forefront of our thinking. In about 2012, we set up a campaign called Trees for Yorkshire. And the idea was to allow local companies, small, medium enterprises in our part of the world, to go onto the website and say they would like to support or get involved with various projects that were near them. That worked reasonably well, but unfortunately, there wasn't enough capacity in the White Rose Forest. I didn't have enough time to do it properly. So that's why I've asked for a full-time external relations manager, so that companies can, whether they want to support financially or want to get involved, can basically be allocated to a White Rose Forest project through the district groups, so they can get direct access. There's a real big call for it. The Northern Network, we've been working with them now for a few months, and it's really exciting what they're going to offer. But we think there's plenty of opportunity for small and medium companies to get involved. But it means having the resource and capacity to manage the White Rose Forest website and the comms plan. And that job, full-time post, is being advertised as of next week. So we will have the capacity. We'll certainly have much more capacity to be able to deal with that. In terms of private sector and expertise, I think the White Rose Forest planning coming autumn will identify areas where individuals might be able to offer some help. And I'll give you one example of that. If we have this plan for at least 1,500 hectares and have a budget of up to 25 million, and there's a variety of other funders, we're going to have a proper management group that's very business focused. Will have to be a small group and chaired with a business brain on it. So there will be opportunities there for people in the private sector who know how to work business plans under pressure, to offer their services to us. That would be very, very welcome. That's one thing that comes to mind. But hopefully I'll be able to illustrate those a little bit better come the autumn.
Fantastic. No, I think that's great. Well, look, and as Mel's just mentioned in the comments box here, it does sound fantastic. The post should bring a lot of value. Indeed, it should. Absolutely. Thank you for your time today, and we're looking forward to being with you again, either via Zoom or in person in the latter part of this year, and hearing how you've progressed, and critically how this group and the networks that we represent and the points of influence that we can bring to bear can actually help drive this in the right direction. So much appreciated. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. Thank you. See you, everybody.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to move on. There are two items, both of which are going to be co-led by Jackie. So the first one relates to devolution and the green infrastructure standards trial, which Jackie and Alison, if she is on screen somewhere. Oh, there she is. Hello, Alison. are going to be co-presenting. Really important in terms of place and spatial planning work. And I think it's something that will feature again in our discussions later when we talk about the emissions reduction programme. And then I suspect that will move reasonably easily into what comes next, which is the economic recovery plan and the updates around that, and particularly where the priority setting is around environment and carbon and some of the big asks there. So that is, I think, Ian and Jackie rather than Alex and Jackie. So Ian, in fact, yes, I can see you are on screen as well, Ian, so that's super. So ideally, in terms of item 6, the one that we're talking about now, if you could again just use the chat function if you need any points of clarification or questions. We'll leave a relatively small gap for discussion on this one, so that we can move on into the economic recovery plan as well, because they do connect together. So if you're seeking clarification, flag it up, and we'll make sure that you get the clarification you need. If there's a burning question or a point you really want to raise, fantastic. If not, we'll move seamlessly on to the economic recovery plan as well. So Jackie and Alison, over to you both.
Thanks, Simon. So this paper is really just to update you on some of the emerging plans from our devolution deal. You'll remember that we brought a very high-level paper in April now to the board, just outlining the wide-ranging list of elements to the devolution deal and how they will benefit and help us to tackle the climate emergency. What this paper is about today is drawing out in particular what we call Workstream 17, which is all around spatial planning elements and how the role that spatial planning can play in tackling the climate emergency. So myself and Alison Gillespie, who is our head of planning, is also here. So Simon says we'll do a bit of a twin track, but we are the kind of co-owners of Workstream 17. And there are three key parts to that work stream. One is very much around this green infrastructure pilot, which I'll talk about. And then the other two areas are the development of a zero emission investment framework and also the production of a spatial development strategy, which Alison will pick up. So I'll just very quickly update you a little bit on the green infrastructure standard pilot, and then I'll pass over to Alison. So in April, I think it's fair to say we probably didn't have a lot of plans set out yet for this pilot. This pilot is very much us working with Natural England and to a lesser extent DEFRA, but they are still supporting this work. And the emphasis of this pilot is really for us to help Natural England to pilot the use of a new national green infrastructure standards. It's something that came out of the 25-year environment plan. And what we will be doing is we have been having a number of discussions with them how best to use the draft trial and the draft standards, and how best to try it here. So where we are right now, we think there's probably a number of elements that we're going to pilot with them. So the first one is very much around reviewing our green and blue infrastructure strategy and delivery plan. So we will be looking at that and making sure that we haven't fully embedded the new standards within that. So that's a relatively straightforward task for us to do with Natural England. The second part is around looking at decision making. So as you'll be aware, I think it's in the major projects update, we are doing a large piece of work to strengthen our decision making around tackling the climate emergency and carbon emissions in particular, and making sure future projects take into consideration the impacts on carbon. So we will be doing a similar thing with Natural England, but embedding the green infrastructure standards within our decision-making processes, and we will try and track that with the carbon parts that I just mentioned. So that's another relatively quite straightforward area that we will be developing through this pilot. The third section will then be looking at a number of tools that Natural England have developed as part of the standard. So there are mapping tools and benchmarking tools. We will be piloting the use of them. And what we are aware of through our green and blue infrastructure strategy and delivery plan already is that we don't have a fully developed set of green infrastructure maps across the city region. So this work will help us to strengthen our mapping capabilities and allow us to have a much more robust set of maps. That will actually put us in a really good position when we then go on to talk about developing a zero emission investment framework, which Alison will talk about. But it will also help us, and I think particularly local authorities, with the forthcoming net biodiversity gain requirements that are linked to planning in the next 2 years. This will become a statutory function. So again, this is about creating a robust evidence base to support that net biodiversity gain element, but it will also support the development of the nature recovery plans and the networks that also sit alongside some of this work. So again, the pilot will help us with the regional strategic work, but also hopefully help the local authorities better prepare for some of these things around nature that are coming forward through the planning process. We also just finally want to take, and again, Noel's here today to talk about our emission reductions pathway, but clearly that work will also have a huge amount of intelligence around land use and agriculture and what we need to do to decarbonise that sector by 2038. So again, the final element to the pilot will be looking at how we can take the findings from the emission reduction pathway, add on the mapping, add on the standards to try and actually start to create a much more robust green and blue infrastructure pipeline, which again will help us to deliver our net zero target by 2038. So that's where the current plan is. Lots of different elements. And again, it's great to have the commitment to vote with Natural England, particularly on this. That will start in about September. We think it'll probably take us about a year. There are various different elements there, but should hopefully at the end of it give us quite a good, robust evidence base to support future work. So I'm going to pass over now to Alison, who, as our head of planning, and I'll let her introduce herself properly, but as head of planning, she will be able to then explain the two other elements to this work stream. Over to you, Alison, if you're still there.
I did hear somebody leave the call. Almost 30 seconds ago. So yes, it looks like it was Alison.
Okay. she may reappear.
Do you want to cover for her by ad-libbing whilst we're waiting for her to come back? Oh, no, okay. She's back. I can see her.
You're back.
Alison,
sorry about that.
No, it was perfect timing to give Jackie the butterflies, so that's fine. So Alison, over to you. I don't think it's just me that's seeing Alison frozen in the top right of my screen, is it?
I think she's frozen again, Simon.
No, yeah, I think so too. Oh gosh.
Poised. Okay. Shall I maybe try and?
Why don't you carry on, Jackie? And if Alison arrives and is unfrozen, she can, give you a physical wave to recognise that she's back with us.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the two other elements to this work programme, as I alluded to, are the zero emission investment framework. So again, you can see in paragraphs 2.6, 2.7, this is very much around us preparing and creating a strategic infrastructure investment framework. So that will start to outline very clearly what our strategic priorities are. We have focused it on zero emission to make sure that it reflects the tackling the climate emergency. So, and again, you can see further down, paragraphs 2.7 onwards, there will be a range of elements to this new framework. So that will include not only the natural capital, green and blue infrastructure, the work that we've been hearing from Guy, but also transport elements, particularly things like electric vehicle and some of the more active travel side of things, digital, flood, sorry, just on the screen here, building, retrofit, waste and minerals. And what it will allow us to do is to have a much more strengthened strategic policy position, but it will also allow us to identify where there are gaps. And those gaps are really important because that will give us an ability to be able to prepare some of those gaps whilst we then ready ourselves to create the spatial development strategy. So that's the other part to this work stream. And the spatial development strategy is very much a strategic and statutory document. So the other two that we've been talking about, the pilot and the investment framework, these are non-statutory planning documents. The spatial development strategy will be a statutory function. And again, this is a way of us strengthening our planning requirements. And again, particularly around tackling the climate emergency. So again, there are a number of things you can see there, 2.9, 2.10 around what it will do, but the SDS will set some common strategic visions and policies, mainly around the strategic coordination, things like energy policy, regeneration, renewal, retrofit, utilities, broadband, those kind of areas of work. And it will allow us to hopefully also set high standards where it allows through things like the national planning policies. So again, it's a really exciting opportunity for us, and it will really help us to drive from a kind of a new development perspective, drive the spatial planning system, helping us to tackle the climate emergency. So that's all I was going to really say. If Alison was here, she would be able to provide. Oh, she is here.
I'm back. I am back, Vicky.
Hi, Alison.
I'm so sorry about that. I'm not sure what's happening, but I seem to be connected for now. But thanks for covering that for me, Jackie. I suppose at least you can put a face to a name, because I'm sure we'll be back to talk about these areas of the work stream again, and obviously can take any questions. I think that with the spatial development strategy, it's probably worth noting that it's unlikely that we'll start any formal work on that in advance of 2022. So we are really seeing this as a sequential programme of work, and the investment framework is a sort of stepping stone towards the SDS. So yeah, if you've got any further questions around that, then please.
There are some questions, and look, don't you worry at all. I think we've all been in the same position that you're in at some point over the last few months. So, there's a few come in. So let's start with a couple of really specific ones. Hang on a moment. I'll tell you what, why don't I do that so you can see me? That's probably better. There we are. So, question from Mel Taylor saying, can you just give a little bit more clarity on what you mean by green infrastructure standard? Is it a planning requirement? Is it specified somewhere? So just if you could elaborate slightly on that, and possibly let's just double up with a question that's come in from one of the two from Rosa, which is another very specific one about the mapping work, and really asking whether or not that's going to take on board some of the issues that we were talking about just before with Guy around the forest, the tree planting and the carbon sequestration and so on. So perhaps if you could help Mel with the definition and link back to the White Rose conversation, that would be helpful. Then we can move on to another couple of questions that have come through.
Yes, so what might be easier, I can actually circulate the kind of proposed standards. So there are, I can't remember off the top of my head, 7 or 8 principles. So it's a set of principles really, as opposed to a kind of a core requirement for planning. But there's a number of tools I mentioned linked to the standard, of which one is related specifically for planning and for developers. So yeah, I'll circulate that because there's quite a lot of elements to it, but it is meant to be very broad brush approach. Yeah. In terms of the mapping that Rosa has asked, absolutely, we will be trying to probably in the next couple of months, when we've got Natural England supporting us fully, trying to pull together everything that we've currently got and then applying what they've got. So again, there is plenty of opportunity to pull together kind of a really good, robust set of maps to support future work in a number of areas.
Great, super duper, thank you very much. So Leah's asking a question linking to another sort of very immediate issue that is very much with us at the moment, which obviously is the airport expansion there. Just really asking to understand a little bit more about how the ZEF relates to the planned airport expansion that we were recently asked to comment on. The reference to recently asked to comment on for others present is that the private sector members of this group fed some perspectives into a note that went to the LEP chair. So that's what that reference is, just for clarity and transparency. So how does the ZEIF relate to the planned airport expansion? And then perhaps we can move on to, once we've had that question addressed, the GBI is the green and blue infrastructure work, looking at some of the nature recovery networks that will be part of the nature strategy around the DEFRA and sort of agenda. So that's a very different sort of line of thinking. So let's deal with the airport first and then move on to the nature recovery. And it suddenly occurred to me that Richard, who is here on the phone, can't use the text box, obviously. And you know what? That hadn't occurred to me, Richard, assuming you can still hear me. So if you want to crash in with a question, I'm more than happy for you to do that, because you can't use any other option, can you? So you go right ahead if you need to. But let's let these two points be addressed first.
Thank you, Simon. Nothing to say at the moment.
So on the ZEIF question relating to the airport, it is a good question. And I think at this stage, we're probably not going to give you a satisfactory answer. So we are still at early scoping stages with that framework. And we really do need to make sure that whatever work we do on that framework strengthens our position, our strategic policy position, and also our case to support further funding asks with government. That will probably be the focus of our attention as we're scoping it. But we actually yet haven't thought that through in enough detail to know whether it would assist us with our position around the airport. Potentially, it might be an opportunity for us to have a strategic position around aviation, and we can come back to you when we've done some further scoping work to see what your thoughts are on that. I mean, some of the initial thoughts that we've had are about whether there are some advantages to us identifying sort of spatial priority areas or opportunity areas that could build on the emissions pathway work. We haven't considered yet whether or not a position on aviation might be part of that framework, but we can take that question away as we do that scoping work.
That's great, thank you. I think in terms of the other points, it's evolved into something of a conversation here in the chat panel around green blue infrastructure and the interactions between flood policy, EA, and then various collaborations. So what I'm going to do is just create a tiny bit of space now to ask either Neville, Rosa, or Jim to come in and articulate a question or make an observation if they want to. Otherwise, we'll take that offline and we'll move on to the economic recovery item so that we can stay fairly close to time. But open invitation now for Jim, Rosa, or Neville to jump in. And knowing that any one of you would have done so, should you have wished, I'm going to take the silence as
Simon, Neville.
Aha! Neville,
I was waiting for Nev.
I'll
have my shout.
you after all,
Nev's
Rosa. No, it's not. I just managed to click onto mute and do the old thing that we all try and avoid. But there you go. I mean, I'm just quickly and building on the point. There's clearly a lot here we're already doing, and we don't need to, I think, reinvent. And just almost within, if we get a small group of us together who are doing this stuff, and I would expect all the sort of private companies, but maybe with Rose herself as well, we could probably pull together something we're already doing that will help you on this, prove the pilot, and actually be a key demonstrator for the region as well.
Great, thank you, Neville. Jim, Rosa?
The parting shot for me would just be, we've got such an opportunity on the air catchment. I thought Nev was going to mention that as well in terms of detail, but Yorkshire Water are collaborating with the Air Rivers Trust on longer term investment planning. So that's like on a totally different side of the NFM work. So that combined with NFM, combined with DNR going into the so that's the fish landscape scale fish pass restoration scheme along the catchment that will see salmon return to Skipton. That, you know, there is an awful lot going on in that catchment upstream of Leeds that makes it a really good flagship for a number of reasons. So again, yeah, very keen to be involved in that conversation, help make it real in a place, because that's how we'll make it happen, right?
And it's a good build, Rose, and maybe we should pick up sort of projects which help you, Jackie, and team in terms of the best demonstrators for this. So let us know, and there's a range of stuff we can bring.
Scott, was that you indicating that you wanted to come in, or were you just adjusting your camera? No, okay, that's fine. So
Simon, it's Jim. I just say, yeah, I was very much on the same lines as Neville there. I think that there's loads of stuff going on already, and I'm presuming that's what we need to capture and channel.
Great. Okay, before we move on, then there's a concluding question from Mel Taylor, really linking back to the ZEIF and wondering whether it would act as an energy action plan for West Yorkshire, or if you consider that to be a separate initiative. So you can see what she's written there. So perhaps we'll just use that as a sort of rounding off question. Then we'll move on to the recovery plan discussion with Ian and Jackie once you've addressed that.
Simon, it's Richard. Do you mind if I just make one observation?
Go right ahead.
I'm not really sure. Yeah, I'm not really sure where this sits in the agenda, but thinking about the Northern Forest, or thinking about the White Rose Forest approach, I'm thinking about the airport. One of the biggest challenges with the airport is how we make carbon neutral rail in that context. An obvious private sector link up would surely be between the airport and the White Rose Forest project, with carbon offsetting and so on. It just seems like an obvious link up between the two, that's all.
Thanks, Richard.
I think, just to reassure, I think that's happening between Polycook, Leeds City Council and the airport. I think they are indeed on that link.
Brilliant, thank you.
No worries.
So, Alison or Jackie, do you want to take Mel's question, and then we'll round this item off and move on to the economic recovery plan.
I mean, Alison also I think we're just poised to answer that. But I mean, I suppose at this point we don't know. It'd be the honest answer. So the investment framework will have a number of things. It isn't just about energy, but I think now what it will certainly do is pull together the energy elements that we do want investment in. So, but I think it probably will also be a wider, far overarching document with other elements as well. Unless Alison is going to tell me otherwise. But.
Nope. That's fine.
Okay, great. Thank you both. Should we move on? Let's move on to the economic recovery plan, the environment and carbon priority. And Jackie's staying with us on this item, and I think Ian is going to join her to go through the paper. Alison, thank you very much. If you're going to stay with us, you're welcome. If not, we'll see you again soon, I'm sure. And so Ian and Jackie, over to you for this important point that then builds straight through into the most substantive of our items, which relates, of course, to something with the same three-letter acronym, which is the emissions reduction pathways, which Noel will lead us through. But there's a good sort of 40 minutes or so assigned to this, which it entirely warrants. So over to you both.
Thank you. I think I'm going to start and just give a general update on progress with the economic recovery plan and what we've done with the feedback that we've had from many stakeholders, but including all the panels of the LEP. Obviously, we had a discussion with this panel, a private discussion, which we've taken all the feedback from, and we have summarised the points that have been made in this panel. And there's an update that's just been published yesterday for the next LEP board, and it includes a paper in there which has a summary of all the points made in the panel discussions. The upshot of the consultation we've been doing is that it's caused us to kind of have a relook at the structure of the plan and to try and simplify it down in something that's much more targeted around some key priorities with a bit more clarity of messaging about what's important. And so how we've done that, where we had five priorities before, of which environment and carbon was one, we've simplified that down into three priorities. I was hoping to be able to share something on my screen with you, but I don't think we're allowed to do that in public meetings. Onto three, where we've kind of made the point up front that everything we do around the economic recovery needs to be both inclusive and tackling inequalities as well as sustainable. And what it struck us, especially after the comments from this panel, is that by considering the environment in isolation, we were missing some of the linkages between the jobs that could be created in the sector and our activities around jobs elsewhere, for example. So we've simplified that down into three priorities, which are good jobs and putting all the opportunities around jobs that we can be created in the economy, including low carbon jobs and in the healthcare sector and so on, alongside all our support for businesses, making the point that everything we do around entrepreneurship, innovation, and so on, and growing sectors is really to provide the good jobs which is being called for, but from both our inclusive growth approach and our environmental sustainability approach. Secondly, the priority around skills, and this is certainly the biggest priority for Councillor Hinchcliffe and the other leaders as well. There's lots of challenges coming through around, especially around apprenticeships and early career jobs, and also it chimes with some of the themes that this panel has been concerned about transition from high to low carbon industry and so on, putting all of that into under one priority. And then thirdly, a priority around infrastructure, and incorporating everything this panel is concerned about around flooding, modern methods of construction, and building on the new technologies that were talked about in the session that we had, as well as ideas that Jackie will run through in a minute around terming the new Green Deal. So that's kind of one way of saying we were trying to embed inclusivity and sustainability throughout all the priorities. And the other way that we're doing that is we're at early stage, but trying to, for every one of the must-win battles, which we took you through before and showed you for every one of those must-win battles across all of our priorities, making sure that we are clear about what our success measures are in terms of economic indicators, social indicators, and environmental indicators, so that we're putting those three lenses across everything that we do, and be clear what we see success as. The other change that came out of some of the comments that this and other panels made was about clarity on messaging around what are the big systemic things that we need to change, and what are the things that we need to do, and the opportunities that we have specifically at West Yorkshire level. So what we've done there is we'll be separating out the to be clear on what are the things that we need to be influencing national governments on, what are the big funding asks that any area of the country would be asking for, and what are the clear opportunities and challenges in West Yorkshire that we can put proposals to government for, where we can offer government and the country something if they want to get alongside us and fund that. And those, so we, in the first instance, and there may be others in the future, in the first instance, we focused on four areas. The first is the opportunities around health tech, with the region being the decision-making centre for national policy, the sector strengths we have across the region, as well as our R&D and data strengths, and linking that strongly with as our contribution to how we can help the country tackle health inequalities that have been particularly highlighted by the crisis. The second proposal we're putting together is one about lives being transformed by digital technology. That brings together everything around innovation and skills, which the Business Innovation and Growth Panel have particularly been leading on, as well as the infrastructure we need to enable both the economic and the behavioural changes that we want to see coming out of the crisis, and also making the point that digital skills and infrastructure are key enablers of a transition towards a more digital economy to ensure the just transition for impacted communities. The third proposal is around entrepreneurship. So we're expecting, as with any recession, that you would see a boom in startup activity. Some of that will be by necessity, but we want to make sure that's turned into an opportunity to really capture and enable people who want to start up their own businesses to do that successfully, to promote innovation, and also to link that with the changing use of the high street and so on, to make sure we're capturing the potential of reusing and repurposing buildings in our communities. And then the fourth area is a proposal that Jackie is putting together and is going to take you through in a moment, about how we transition to a net zero resilient economy. So we've got some real clarity about what the opportunities specifically to West Yorkshire are, and what we need government to come alongside us to help achieve that. So that's where we've got to with the plan overall. We've got another economic recovery board this week on Thursday, and then our plan, if that goes well, is to then publish the plan at the end of next week, along as part of the combined authority papers for the meeting on the 27th of July. One thing that has become clear through the process is that our local authority as partners, and we've been very clear that this plan needs to link up with plans of partners, whether that be transport, health, or local authority. We mustn't duplicate, and we need to make sure they support each other. Local authorities are probably they've just started publishing their local plans, but some won't be available until the autumn. So we expect to come back to our plan in the autumn to have another look about how we line up with our partner plans. So we're very much seeing this plan for the end of this month as being an initial regional plan that we will revisit over time as partner plans become clear, and also as the crisis and the recovery progresses. And you'll recall from the previous session that we've got a number of scenarios that we're considering within the plan to make sure it is robust to whatever happens during the recovery, whether it's a quick recovery or a much slower recovery. So I think at that point, Jackie, I'll hand over to you to talk a bit more detail about the Green New Deal proposal.
Thanks, Ian. So yeah, picking up on what Ian's been saying, then there's a really exciting opportunity there for us to really create a really exciting proposition to present to government. So I think on the 23rd when we met, we kind of outlined some elements of this, but we've obviously developed a bit more since. And I know that also a number of you are either already helping us to further support this proposition, and a few of us, Mel, Jim, others, we are desperately still trying to have a chat probably this week or next week about some of this as well. So there's still opportunity really for everybody to help us shape this proposition over the next week or so. So I think Jeanette very kindly, just before the meeting started, did share a presentation. It's got a couple of slides on there. I'm just going to talk you through those because, as Ian says, we can't share them. Does everybody have access to them? I'm going to anybody shout if you don't, rather than the opposite way around. Excellent. I'm going to take that you can already see it. So I'll talk very quickly through this, and it'd be great to get everybody's kind of comments, views, etc. on it. So what the offer is this is around us accelerating the zero carbon transition to support our city region to recover from the COVID-19 crisis. We are calling it the transition to a net zero carbon resilient economy. And it really has two key stages. The first one, as you would imagine, is very much what happens in this rescue stage. That's the first 12 months. And again, I think on the 23rd, we talked about this already. Clearly, part of that is around capitalising on the pro-environmental behaviours that we have seen during lockdown. So again, a lot of this proposition is around the walking and cycling elements. And again, we spoke about this on the 23rd. For those who weren't here on the 23rd, there is going to be obviously a separate section on transport, a separate plan as well on it. So again, the walking and cycling elements will be picked up through transport plans, as well as some of the home working elements. The second part to this rescue stage for our proposition is also around accelerating shovel-ready projects, tackling climate emergency projects, we're calling them. So that we are hoping will include any immediate flood schemes. So again, we are talking with Yorkshire Water in particular around whether there are any in the next 12 months that could be developed. But also looking at, we've heard from Guy, tree planting is another obvious area that could deliver quite a lot of benefits in the next 12 months. As well as we have already started to collate a rather comprehensive list of energy efficiency spade-ready schemes, again, that could be delivered in the next 12 months, and a few public buildings as well. The reason why we are proposing those work is that all of those types of projects are intense in terms of the jobs that they require to do them. They are technical, some are technical, but some are also volunteering opportunities. They also require skill sets. So again, this is a way of us very upfront priming the economy to recover through some of these immediate schemes. And as you can see, they're in yellow at the moment, but we will hopefully be able to submit some of those spade readies for consideration as part of this proposition. Moving on to slide 2 then, this is where we start to look beyond the first 12 months into our recovery, reimagining, and ultimately, as you get up to kind of 5-year plus stage, into the resilience stage. And there are a number of elements to this proposition within that time frame. So the first one is around the development of a pipeline of low carbon and climate investment opportunities. And this will then be supported also by an implementation strategy. So by implementation, I actually mean how we might actually fund some of this work. So this will be a much longer term pipeline. Obviously, we will be able to develop a number of them in the more immediate term, but some will be longer term. Our ask is very simple, and it's around having the revenue to develop the pipeline. This isn't a capital ask. This is asking for some revenue for people, experts in their field, to help the city region to actually develop that pipeline. At the moment, you all know we've got some projects, we've got the energy accelerator, we've got other things, but we don't have that all-encompassing pipeline like transport do, like housing do, and we really need it in order to start to ultimately get the investment that we know we need. We also know there are a number of big funding pots coming up through things like it could be gain share, it could be shared prosperity fund, energy efficiency through BEIS in particular. We are still expecting 9 billion as promised, although obviously today we've heard how maybe 3 billion will be funded. But without a pipeline, we are never going to get the type of investment that we need. So we need the pipeline. That pipeline will also include the 125 million ask already in there for flood alleviation schemes. But again, we will explicitly include that in there. And as you can see there at the bottom of that slide, we will include a number of other tackling climate emergency capital projects. So energy efficiency, zero carbon homes could also include things like the wider how to decarbonise heating in your homes and also buildings. Tree planting, nature recovery, we've talked about. Flood alleviation, we've already talked about. We would like to also include in there climate resilience projects. So that could obviously be the kind of tree planting, but could also be things like peatland recovery and other projects to help us build more resilience into our communities as our climate continues to change. We would also like to include in there, if it's relevant, both low carbon energy generation projects, but also energy generation projects. So again, I've put there, and we will be having a discussion, hopefully this week or early next week, with people like Northern Gas Networks and Northern Power Grid, Jim and Mel in particular, to see if there's an opportunity to pull in any of their work that they are doing around the economic recovery into this, if it's relevant. And again, I've touched on transport. We don't want to duplicate what's in the other transport strategies, but where there may be gaps, we might look to support it there. So that's our first key ask. It's around having some resource in the region to pull together that pipeline. The second part to that then is around a green skills programme. So once we've got the pipeline, we know where we are heading in terms of the key infrastructure that we require. So then we need to build the skills programs. Unfortunately for us, you can't really wait for the pipeline to start to build skills programs. So we need to do these in parallel to some extent. So the second part to the ask is around a green skills program to support the pipeline. This is broken down into two parts. So the first part being very much around creating a net zero carbon skills partnership. We can work on the title, but as you would expect, that's the aim is to bring together properly all the right partners across the city region and to have some kind of coordinating role. So again, the ask is for some revenue for a person or persons to coordinate education, skills employment, and a range of other people to help us understand what those future skills require and need and what employers will need and how we can start to best support that, meet that. So that's the first part. Then so we'll do that in the first year. The second year is then very much piloting a workforce fund. So again, that is very much then addressing the skills gaps that we'll have identified in that coordinating first part to this programme. We'll then look at employer and trainers support and what they'll need to kind of upskill people. There'll also be a careers element to this work, and then also new methods of recruitment. So what we will end up with in 2 years is not only a partnership that's helping to really drive forward this agenda, we'll also have a kind of a pilot, and we would ask for, again, proper significant money, maybe a couple of million even, to then have this workforce fund to support the development as it moves forward. The final part to the proposition, again, as everyone would imagine, is a section and program around business opportunities. So if you think about the emission reductions pathway work that we're doing in our net zero carbon target, which Chanel will talk about, we are starting to identify what we will need to do to decarbonise all of our sectors, the business sector and energy intensives in particular, but also all of the businesses that we have in our economy. They will all need to decarbonise, and there is a lot of things we can do to start to support them. And we know that there's lots of new economic opportunities, new markets, new business opportunities, supply chain opportunities, inward and export opportunities. So this package starts to pull together that level of support to make this happen, linked to not only the tackling the emergency, but also meeting these economic opportunities that we need to maximise through our recovery plan. So again, there are some elements within this programme of work. Particularly, we have a green business top-up fund. So again, it's likely we'd ask for probably under maybe something like £500 to £1 million worth of funding to support what we're calling a business top-up. So that would be to further support our ReBiz programme. ReBiz, for members will remember, is our resource efficiency fund, number 2, which is out there supporting businesses. So again, we want to do more. So we look to support at least another 150 businesses in the next 3 years through that top-up fund. We'd also like to probably understand whether there are other elements to that package that we can really promote to support businesses in the next year or two anyway, as they move forward and recover. The second part is then having some kind of full-time officer. Again, this is a resource ask around somebody that can really work with the energy and carbon intensive businesses in our region to understand how they are faring in light of recovering from COVID-19 and what more they need support on. We know they will need support regardless of COVID-19 in terms of decarbonising, and we don't want to lose those businesses. So again, this is an opportunity for us to support them specifically with any unique bespoke support they will have, particularly around heat going forward. And then the final element to this is just around a COVID gap funding. Again, this is much more of a technical thing. Our current schemes are obviously quite delayed, and that has knock-on effects with our European funding. So we would probably ask for some support with that. So that is a very, very quick summary of what is quite a detailed proposition. I'm probably going to stop there, pause, and let you all kind of give me your views on that. Again, it'd be really good to understand, in particular, if there are areas that we have missed. But the final point I will make is that we will not only use this as our proposition, but those elements that I've just whizzed through and any other ones that we come across in the next week or so will also be fully embedded into those 3 priorities that Ian talked about, to ensure that the embeddedness is fully there. Sorry, I'm just being blinded by the sun here. So over to you guys, really, for comments.
Thanks, Jackie. Thanks. There's a couple of questions in the chat. Okay, there's some feedback. So what I'm going to do is let others have a little bit of time to add additional questions here. So I'll ask a couple of my own. One I know has been sort of in circulation, which really is about that shift from the sort of the low carbon agenda from being an explicit priority to being an overarching sort of frame of reference type agenda. And there are some of us who've been in this world for an awfully long time and have seen that happen and seen it translate into a deprioritization rather than anything else. So I guess what I'm asking for there is, just for the benefit of all members, is just a quick reflection on that, and really just to give us the reassurance that actually it is a a true priority and a real frame of reference against which other priorities will be judged, rather than a convenient way to nudge this agenda into the longish grass. And the other one is really to ask for a reflection. And this is a slightly unfair question, Ian. I really understand it before I ask it, so dodge away if you need to. But we heard from Rishi Sunak today about some commitments around insulation for homes, about grants and so on and so forth. How do we think that those national commitments, somewhat watered down given earlier kind of promises, might affect our big asks and the way that we can try and create leverage as a region or as sub-regions within within this context? So a bit of reassurance and a bit of reflection, and that's also to buy a bit of time for others to come up with their own questions. I can see a few coming through now.
So on the assurance, I think, yes, it's a good challenge, and one of the interesting aspects of this work is, as you'll recall from the previous discussion, we've tried to be very clear between what we need to do in the short term, the medium term, what we're calling the reimagining phase, and then the longer term, the kind of resilience phase. And it won't surprise you to hear that many people who are dealing with this crisis on the front line day to day are very much looking at that short term phase. So top of everyone's mind is perhaps not even is just jobs, not even necessarily. Well, no one want bad jobs. It's not necessarily pushing the good jobs agenda in the very short term, and we're really concerned not to lose sight of those longer term challenges, which this panel has made a big contribution to through the various discussions. And then the second reflection was actually a lot of the themes that this panel talked about in the session that we had on the recovery panel really talked about that much wider. Those much wider themes, that it was about the jobs that a clean growth focus could create, those sector opportunities, the skills that are needed for those, the infrastructure that's needed to enable a just transition, so that people can take advantage of those opportunities. And really, they were the same themes that we were talking about in the wider work. So. By being and the same kind of thinking applied to the inclusive growth discussion, and so we just felt it was a better way to put the fact that we want any recovery to be sustainable and inclusive right at the front, rather than trying to separate it out as a separate topic. And while that gives it, having it as a separate topic, give it focus, we felt it underplayed the importance of it and the contribution it could make across the whole agenda. And then, as I said before, the real way that I wanted to make sure that it's really tied in, to be clear that we're seeing success across those three dimensions, that it's not just about the economic success, but it's about social progress and environmental progress as well, and making sure that whether we're talking about supply chains, entrepreneurship, some of the infrastructure stuff, that we're clear for each of those dimensions what we see success as. And we haven't thought about that in depth at the moment, but Jackie and I have been working on what some of those things, but it allows us to bring in some maybe around supply chain, some of the circular economy type indicators and so on. So we see this as an opportunity to kind of embed it across the agenda and not just see it as a separate thing.
I think framed like that, that's really positive. And Jeanette, I think that's something that colleagues would really like to see, minuted firmly, because that is really important to us. We've talked about that a lot. It's great that it's come through in that respect. But so thank you for that clarity. Thank you.
Sorry, there was a second question, wasn't there, Simon? It was unfair, sorry.
No, the second question was me deliberately burning airtime to give people to ask questions, which they have been now doing. But it was really just to ask whether you had any reflections on the.
Oh yes, so I think our initial reflection is that we'd hope that the announcement on home insulation is a start rather than the entirety of it. So I don't think it fundamentally changes what we see as the ask. I think, you know, it does talk a bit to some of the things that Jackie's been talking about in terms of it creates jobs in the clean growth space and so on. But I think we'd want to be much more ambitious than that in the opportunities that we think a national intervention could make. So we haven't seen the detail of what that scheme might look like and how it might impact at a regional level. But yeah, I don't know if Alan or Jackie, you've got anything any further reflections on that?
I mean, I think it's a start. It's not the 4.9 million that we were promised for energy efficiency for both domestic and public buildings. So it's a good start. We'll happily spend it, but yeah, we'd like access to the remaining 6 million as well. 6 billion, sorry, as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we'll also want to, when we see the detail, and as Ian said, that we haven't got any, we'll want to see what we can do to support people and businesses in the region to access it. So we don't know, for instance, what the application process is going to be, who's going to manage the money, anything like that. And so we'll want to see what role we can play in making sure that we get, or places within our people and businesses and places within our region get, you know, at least what you might consider to be their fair share, whilst acknowledge. So I suppose our overall view is it's not enough. It's a start, but we wouldn't turn down access to. We wouldn't turn it down.
Yeah, no, that's a really important point, Alan. Thank you for that, and certainly, you know, for benefit of colleagues, conversations that we have around the LEP board that are also in the public domain quite often touch on the need to make our support and the opportunities that we collectively seek to offer more accessible and more addressable by members of the community as a whole. And we do tend to find that our attraction gets concentrated in certain parts of society and not in others. And so really being creative about how we lay this open and encourage people towards the support and the opportunities that exist is work in itself, I think. So yeah, I think that's a really important point. Thank you. So a number of questions coming through. So what I'm going to do here, a number of them are very specific sort of call and response questions, but I'm seeing from Ben Tong that he started off by asking a question via the text and is now saying that he'd rather frame it on video. So what I'm going to do, Ben, is in a moment invite you to do that. I'm going to check in with Richard, who can't type. So Richard, if you've got a question or an observation, you go right ahead. If not, we'll switch to Ben, or we'll switch to Ben after you've asked your question, and then we'll come to some of those more specific ones.
It's possibly that's the question, more maybe we'll pick it up offline, but I'd be interested in digging into the pipeline idea, which I wholeheartedly endorse, trying to get funding to get a pipeline together. But I think if there's a question in there at all, it's what do we think we're going to add in trying to pull that pipeline together? In other words, is there something uniquely public sector that means that could be successful in comparison to, so for example, if there was a pipeline of energy projects out there, why hadn't the private sector brought them forward already?
So, Richard, sorry, it's Jackie here. We have been obviously talking to a lot of our public sector partners about this, and a lot of the time there is ideas, but these are not projects that are ready, and they're definitely not investment ready. So there is a need, I think, to pull together these ideas and then to come up with a significant project development support to then be able to have that investment ready proposals for the private sector, for the investors. At the moment, we are struggling to pull together some of that investment because we can't even outline what the proposal is, what's the art of the possible, because it isn't in one place, it isn't clearly articulated. So what we're trying to do, particularly for the public sector, is pull that together in one place, and then you have a much clearer proposition that you can go out to the market to ask them to see if they would be interested in deliver. Or the other side of that is that we can then start to say, well, there's opportunities here from the 9 billion, if we get that, to bid together, to then share procurement, to do this collectively, economy of scale, all of those elements. That we're just not in a position right now to do any of that because we don't have a robust pipeline. There's a few ideas and that's it. We're never going to draw in the hundreds of millions that we need without starting with that robust developed pipeline, and it won't be perfect, but enough to get that interest in the investments.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Jackie. Ben, over to you. Why don't you pick up both of your questions in one go and come onto video to do that?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm just going to leave my sort of technical question there to pick up now or in minutes, but I've got a big picture question I wanted to pose. I think it's links into the previous meeting that we had and the comments I gave at my last meeting that was looking at the economic recovery plan. But and it links into this piece and also the net zero plan later on the agenda. I suppose I just want to kind of offer a bit of a challenge, really. I mean, a proposition could be the green economy panel could see it as a challenge to try and create a space for creating a stable environment to become a top priority, like a really true essential objective for us. I mean, the economy's failing. I would argue strongly, I don't have empirical evidence for this, but it seems quite clear that we're not going to have enough money to deliver what we need to do here. The GDP system, as I've previously mentioned on these calls, is failing environment and society, and there's a need to move to alternative prosperity metrics. But I think the thing is, how do we create a political environment where that becomes a good thing to do, where people are going to want to see that, the voters are going to want to see that. And, you know, something I've been chewing over with people a lot recently is, I think one way of doing this, and something that we're starting to see a bit more of now, is future visioning exercises, talking about, 10, 20, 30 years down the line, what's society going to be up against in terms of challenges from climate and ecological breakdown. And, that kind of conversation for me is something that could really push this up the agenda. And I think it's something, I know we need all this nuts and bolts planning stuff, and it's got to be done. But I just think until the kind of demand's there for it and the resources are there for it, it's, there's a real danger that we can spend so much attention on the detail, but never actually get in a position to achieve it because of many different reasons, most of them political. I just thought I'd throw that out there just to see what people think.
What does Alan think?
Well, I don't know if you want an officer answer.
Yeah, that's right.
I can give you an officer answer to that. This is, I mean, it's gone hugely up the agenda over the last year or two. The Combined Authority and the LEP have added first clean growth and now tackling the climate emergency as its to its priorities. A comment. Sorry, I'm conscious it's a public meeting. So how can I put this? It was interesting reading the manifestos at the last general election to see how many of the political parties had this agenda on their manifestos compared with if you'd looked at the same manifesto, say in 2010. And I think so there is without a doubt, this has gone higher up the agenda. I think the challenge going forward is how it gets balanced against the other challenges facing the city region and how you then sell it to people. So, there is inequality within our region. There are people living in poverty, and the question is, part of the question is, we need to support those people to get out of poverty. It comes to Ian's point about, in the immediate term, as we recover from the pandemic, there are hundreds of thousands of people on furlough, loads of people have lost their jobs, and there is an element of we need to get people back to work. But longer term, this is absolutely at the top of the agenda. It's simply that but it isn't the only, it's not the only objective. There are other objectives as well. And I think part of the challenge here is how can you harness the objectives that we're trying to achieve on tackling the climate emergency in order to create the jobs and the wealth and the prosperity that then enable some of those other issues that the region is facing to be dealt with. So as an example, we think that there are loads of estimates, you can throw big numbers around. The lowest number I've seen today in about how many jobs could be created in the green economy is 70,000. And the highest is well into the hundreds of thousands of jobs that could be created. And that's all opportunity for people. Similarly, retrofitting homes is going to create jobs, but we need investment. We need to support businesses to lever in private investment to get into that space, and we also need to support people to develop the skills. So this comes to the point about the economic recovery plan, where carbon has not been put down the agenda at all. The point is to embed it as a central objective of our skills ambitions, our business and growth ambitions, and our infrastructure ambitions. I'll stop there.
Can I add one thing to that, Ben? So I think, Alan's saying fine, but there might be just a really practical solution to some of this that might not necessarily just have to be about the economic recovery plan and the work of the board. So Simon and I took a paper to the LEP, seems like months ago, it was only last month, kind of getting their support for all of the panels to start to come up with really practical plans on how they're going to decarbonise their areas of work and help us to deliver what we need to deliver the net zero of carbon. Simon very kindly, with our support, offered to do a session with the LEP around kind of why they need to start to tackle the climate emergency. I'm wondering if actually this idea of a vision, we could maybe try and maybe this panel wants to maybe offline put some thought into that. Maybe there's an opportunity to kind of do both at the same time. So we have the kind of outlining what that long-term vision is and the opportunities are, coupled with then the need for each of the panels to start to actually go away and start to develop their contribution to tackling the climate emergency. It just seems like maybe there's an opportunity there. Clearly we need to do some of this within the realms of this economic recovery plan, but I think there are some of these things, and these are really big fundamental systematic changes, aren't they, that maybe we could also deal with through the LEP and the offer of a bit more of a focused session. It's just a suggestion.
I think it's a really good idea, Jackie. I think it is a really good idea. I mean, that offer was made in the context of a really well engaged conversation with LEP board colleagues and others, and a strong recognition, in fact one that was evidenced earlier in terms of the connection to the place panel, that we as the Green Economy panel cannot possibly carry this fight on our own. We simply can't. It has to be interlinked and be a true team effort across all those who've got the ability to create influence and to drive change. And yeah, I think that's a really interesting way of framing it. I think, Ben, it's an incredibly valuable contribution you made to the last conversation, and again, a really valuable contribution to this too. It is systems level stuff, but we're entangled, aren't we, in a whole sequence of challenges that range against each other. And I know we all recognise that, because we recognise it in our day jobs and also in these types of discussions. And I have no compunction in sharing that in a public meeting either. It's just true. It's really difficult. If it feels hard, it's because it is. And I think possibly a constructive first step will be to do exactly what you suggest, Jackie, actually, and put a bit more oomph behind that suggestion of bringing something together at a LEP level and bringing some of those systems change pieces. And I know, Ben, also you are, and others present, Rosa, you and I have talked about this too, is about harnessing the potential power of the arts community to communicate and engage with society in a different sort of way. We've talked about that. I think perhaps we should prioritise that as well, because there are a set of skills there that are there to be mobilised, and different forms of connecting and engaging with people that really aren't going to come from a corporate or transactional form of communication. They're going to come from a much more emotive and effective form of communication, and they're not skills that I have, but I certainly value those skills, and I know that we are surrounded by people who are able to. support us in that way, and no doubt are willing to. So let's double those actions up and see what we can do between now and the next meeting.
Simon, I'm just conscious there's quite a few questions about, firstly, whether the 52 million that was announced for the Combined Authority for getting building fund is how this is all linked. And then there's also a series of questions, I think, from Jim and others around, does government know this proposition is coming?
Yeah, I was looking at those. I think possibly what we'll do is maybe take the question about the relationship with the 52 million and also Sarah, Councillor Ferraby's question about flood alleviation and so on. Rosa wants to come in also, so perhaps if we take those two first questions, then let Rosa come in, because I suspect there'll be a linkage there around resilience, and then we can maybe just invite Jim to round the question up himself and re-articulate it rather than me try and interpret it, because it's broken over two posts. So if we take those first two, then invite Rosa in, and then Jim, if you come in and ask your question or pose your point or however you want to frame it, that might be the most effective way to go.
Do you want me to take the 52 million one?
Please.
You will. So
I'll say something about the 52 million one. So we're very constrained in what we can spend the 52 million pounds on. We need to agree a series of schemes with government. They're not really new schemes. They're things that are it's things that can be accelerated, and it all needs to be spent by March 2022. So we've got 18 months effectively to spend that money. I'm not in a position to say precisely what it's going to be spent on, because that is still being finalised and needs to be agreed with government over the next couple of weeks. But it's fair to say that what we will be looking at spending it on will be programmes that, or schemes that are support the agenda. But it's not like we've got. I suppose the answer that people probably want is that I can say that we're going to spend 52 million pounds on the projects within this pipeline. That's not the position that we're in. So we need to go to government and ask them for more, which is what Jackie's proposition is about.
Yeah, I think that's the key point there, Alan, isn't it? Really, that's the point. That which we have isn't going to go far enough, and therefore it really does place the focus on the ask, and all those that can rally around and support that ask. I think there's a real window of opportunity at the moment for that, I guess, Jackie.
Yeah.
Is there anybody? Shall we pass across to Rosa? Rosa.
Sorry, Simon. Do you want me to just answer very quickly the Councillor Ferraby's question on the dams in particular before we move on? Sorry,
sure. I was imagining that Rosa might link to that, but yes, if you want to. And then pass across the road, that's fine. No, of course.
I mean, really, really quick answer. The answer is the pipeline is ours to develop. So yes, of course we can, with partners and yourselves, we can look at all sorts of things like that. Absolutely.
Thank you for that, Jackie. Can I just expand a little bit? Because the thing is, we need to also look at things logically. So part of our plans is building homes that are more environmentally friendly and ecologically sustainable. But one thing that I've noticed is that in among our climate work, we still have hot summers, and we see dams, reservoirs, etc. decreasing. We build more homes, and it's about the sustainability of provision of those utilities that we all take for granted. And I think it's an area that we really need to push on with our partners and government, is to ensure that, we have these countries that have are desert countries, and they have desalination facilities. We have an abundance of floodwaters, and I know it's all about channeling and treatment, but I think in alleviating floods, we need to look at long-term use of what we have. Those natural resources going forward.
Thank you. Rosa, why don't you come in now, and then once we've heard from you, and built on that conversation, we'll go to Jim, and I'm just going to use the time just to read the text because there's quite a bit coming in as well. So, Rosa, over to you.
Yeah, okay. So thank you for expanding that, Councillor Ferriby, because I think Neville might actually want to come back to you on that in terms of long-term water resources and supply, rather than myself. I think my points were more building. So first, I really support Jackie's sort of suggestion of that session. I think that would be really good. It's more building on sort of Ben's, the points that Ben was making, and the different perspectives. Increasingly, I think, and I'm aware of the public meetings also, but I think that a really important perspective to maintain on the climate emergency is health, and the impact on people's health. Both immediate now, so the people, and I know Councillor Patient will be able to talk to this in terms of Calderdale as well, but the impact on people's mental well-being through repeated flood events and living with flood risk is significant, but as are heat waves, and that is much more broad. So I know I'm talking to the converted on this panel, but I think it's important not to lose sight of that. Leah, you're part of this as well, but we had a very interesting discussion at the Chambers where we're talking about the Leeds Flood Alleviation Scheme and the Natural Flood Management Programme. And what really struck me there, and it builds on a point Natasha's made in the chat actually, but there is huge willingness to invest in climate emergency work, so be it carbon reduction, be it carbon balancing or absorption, or however you want to describe it, and indeed recognising the importance of soil health and those wider sort of systems benefits. That is there. What's really struck me is that the challenge is to work out how to attract that investment in. So I think as public, and I speak for the EA here as well, as public bodies, we're very accustomed to different grants of different forms, and bringing those together to make multiple benefit schemes and initiatives. But I think what we really need to focus on, so maybe it's not about, although I like the spirit of it, that prosperity matrix and moving away from GDP, but actually I think it's about how we bring in that private investment, because I think all sizes of businesses are really keen to do that. And that's the main gap. That's it from me.
Thank you, Rosa. No, and I think again, to echo your point, it's the note that Natasha put up there is really very helpful. I think it's a comment rather than a question. So just invite colleagues to read on the chat there, and mindful of time, because what I don't want to do is ironically end up reducing the amount of time we talk about emissions reduction by talking about the economic recovery. So I'm going to hand to Jim, and if you want to pose your comments and frame your question, and then once we're done with that, we will wrap this one up and we'll move on to the final substantive item 8, which is around emissions reduction pathways, which Noel is going to be leading. So final comments, questions and words to you, Jim.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. So I think from my perspective, the two comments I stuck in the chat were, the first one was about I guess how we can work together to maximise the chances of success. I suppose we want to win, we want to get this funding, we want to get things going in West Yorkshire. So and the region. So it was really just a question about that. And I think in particular, it links also through to not only, I guess, how we can get behind that, but also how we value and how, listening to what you said, Jackie, you're saying in response to one of the early questions, you said, well, I'm looking for a list of projects. At the moment, the list is quite short. I haven't got a lot on there. We need to get some more throughput. I'm hoping that we get to a stage where actually we're into prioritise and ranking those projects. And that's where some of the principles of, social inclusivity and trying to make sure we get the very best projects, the very best outcomes, is the really important thing. And I think that links through to my second point, which is about what can we do as members of this panel and representatives of industry, and how can we contribute to the debate and help to achieve that. I guess the question is, it was a question about what's, I guess, specifically do you want from us? Because I think we've got a fairly good handle, and the previous discussion teased it out quite well. The one we had on, was it 23rd of June or something, going back a couple of weeks, because we talked about the outcomes we're seeking. So we gave that a good sort of discussion, and we talked about some changes to the outcomes, but we had a kind of a view of outcomes. I think what you're saying is now, well, let's move on to projects that help deliver those outcomes. That's where we need to go. And I guess it's I think what you want from us, just answering my own questions, I think you're looking for us to bring our expertise and our knowledge and suggest where some of the best projects and the outputs from those projects could really deliver those outcomes. I think that's what you're seeking. It was I guess it was an extent was also about saying, you know, are we? I'm not sure we're looking to in the same way that government often comes up with a sort of list of investment, a list of existing projects that are already funded. I guess they're only necessary insofar as they provide ideas upon which we can build. So say, well, we're already doing this over here, and we're doing this over there. That's already funded. That's going on. But we think now we can do join the dots or fill in the gap between and deliver a much better outcome and deliver that sort of leverage on the existing investment. So I'm presuming you want that to be part of the conversation as well. But that was my thoughts, Jackie. I appreciate, as you've said, we need to get together, get our heads together and take it forward. But thank you. That's my thoughts.
Thanks, Jim. I think the really quick answer is there's definitely lots of different things we can do. So immediately, it would be great for me, you, Mel, Neville, and through Neville's colleagues actually to identify those shovel-ready projects that potentially, for whatever reason, can't quite get over the line. That maybe as a collective we should have a discussion about whether you guys as the utilities have got any of those. And like you say, are we stronger together if we build those into the propositions? That's kind of the immediate kind of ask. And then the second part is then saying, well, actually, is there value in us when we build this longer term pipeline, so beyond the 1 year? Probably takes a year, 2 years to develop it, to get that project development support, but is there value in us pulling together all of the other things like the dams, the water storage, your work in the longer term? Again, there are things that can't quite get over the line. Is there value in it also sitting in this work to bring it out and to actually get that investment that we need? So that's the longer term ask, is to work with us. We need the resource, which is the initial ask. Then once we've got that person in post, people in post, whatever it ends up being, it's to work with them to help us to build that pipeline.
Got you. Thanks, Jackie. That's useful.
And it might also be, so I think you mentioned things like heat pumps and stuff like that West Midlands are doing. I don't think we're there yet in terms of, we can't put a proposition to government yet, but that would be, prioritisation wise. You'll hear Noel talk about it in a minute. We have this emission reductions pathway stuff, and that will start to give us those clear, immediate things that we need to start. So that is a way of us also prioritising how these move forward. And the other side of it is, can we maximise the economic multipliers? So what do we need to do for the carbon side, but what are those economic multipliers, and also the health social benefits? When you put those all together, could look at things like the 6 Capitals programme that I know Neville and others use. You could then start to see a really robust pipeline, prioritised pipeline. It's an investment proposition for us to start to draw in that money that we need in probably 2 years' time, something like that. If that's very ambitious, but that's where we could be, in 2 years' time.
Yeah, got it. Thank you.
Jackie, just a quick one. I assume you're talking to people in the Leeds Climate Commission, because they're developing a sort of similar plan around net zero. So they might have some stuff.
Well, I'd love to say, Ben, we can fully align it. We're definitely talking to them and trying to align it all in one go, but obviously that will be hard to do, but we are absolutely talking to them about it, yeah.
Okay, great.
Thank you. Right, we have an hour of this meeting left, and what I don't want to do, given that it's finishing at 7 o'clock anyway, is to run it over, but I also don't want to leave us with too little time to take the next item around emissions reduction pathways. Noel, are you? I can't see. Yes, I can see you. So are you ready to go and lead us through this? Again, what we're going to do here is I will just keep an eye on the on the chat. If you can sort of preload some questions or observations, please do that. And just to let you know that we've been joined in the meeting proper by Richard, so he's not on a phone anymore. He's managed to find a stable internet link, and so he's with us, which is great news. So, Noel, with Jackie, I'll hand over to you, and then I shall keep an eye on the chat for the questions and the thoughts that no doubt are going to build up as we go through this item.
Thanks, Simon. Afternoon, everybody. So I'm going to lead you through what obviously you've seen from the papers is quite a weighty piece of work. So what I'm going to do is sort of try and divide it into 4 sort of logical parts, really, and at the end of each of the sort of parts, just pause for questions. So I'll talk about sort of, you know, the overall, the headliners on this piece of work, what it's sort of telling us. And then pause for a few questions, and we'll talk about sort of dig into the detail around some of the sectors, you know, what is each of the pathways sort of saying specifically for that sector. I'll then talk about the common actions, and then we'll talk about engagement. So I'll pause for questions at the end of each of those sections, just so everybody sort of has an opportunity to feed into this. I guess really what we're looking for from this is we're going to the combined authority, the intention of going to the combined authority at the end of this month to get the combined authority to endorse, have oversight of the findings of this work, but also it's their opportunity to put the approval for us going out and talking to a wider stakeholder audience on this work, and for the next steps of the work to actually go forward. So you know, it'd be really great if at the end of this we can get some endorsement from yourselves that they are recommendations up to the combined authority for that to happen. So without further ado, I'll launch into this. So I will attempt. I won't, because I can't share my screen, so apologies for that. I'll just go through a presentation which we'll circulate after the event. So what I wanted to kind of do was up front give you a very quick summary of what these pathways are actually telling us here. So first thing to say is West Yorkshire can get to where we need to be. So our endpoint is the 2030 800% being net zero carbon by 2038. And we do that through 2 ways. We achieve the emission savings that are set out within the document. So they range from anywhere between 73 and 82% of the way towards where we need to get to by 2038. Obviously depends on which pathway is taken, the types of measures and interventions that are applied. The remaining emissions, so anywhere between 18 and 27%, can be delivered through a combination of ways. It's either increasing our ambition around particular things, and I'll touch on what that might look like later in the presentation, but also it could look at applying innovative emission reduction technologies as well. And again, we'll talk about what they might be as we move through. Just to say up front, we haven't selected a preferred pathway at this moment in time. This is because there is too much uncertainty around the measures that are within each of the different ways we get towards 2038. So a good example of that is national policy on heat decarbonisation. And then the final point, just to really sort of highlight to you, is really these are the first part of the picture on this study. They are the emerging results of task 1. We have another 2 tasks that underpin this work as well, and they'll build on what's happened, what we've seen through task 1, and we'll explore with sort of our stakeholders how we can actually fully achieve the target that we've set. And again, I'll talk about the engagement approach further on in this presentation. So the first thing I wanted to touch on really was around the current situation within West Yorkshire. Very, very quickly, our emissions are around 11.1 megatons of CO2 within West Yorkshire, dominated very much by the transport sector and the building sector. From a transport perspective, what we're looking at here is 4.9 megatons comes from our transport system in West Yorkshire, which is primarily dominated by road transport side of things, so cars, vans, HGVs, those types of things. Our buildings roughly is split 2/3 towards domestic emissions, a third around non-domestic emissions. And then the other sectors, industry, land use and agriculture, waste, much smaller proportions. Industry is the largest of those three categories that I've just talked about. We don't have heavy industry base here. We're not a Humber, we're not a Teesside, so that is reflective of the lack of sort of really heavy refining, cement manufacturing sort of industries that we don't have within West Yorkshire. So what are the pathways actually telling us here? So the first one we looked at is really around our baseline scenario. And this is basically saying, taking all the policies that are in place at this moment in time and working out where we get to basically by 2038. And what we see is a 32% reduction in emissions through just what's in place at the moment, really. So it gets us somewhere of the way there. We make some progress, but obviously it isn't enough. Then we come into the pathways towards 2038 and what this actually says. So if we start with the maximum ambition one, this is really about going as hard and as fast as we think is feasible towards our target. So the headliner there is 82% reduction in emissions can be achieved by 2038 through the measures that have been modelled. So you have remaining emissions around 2 megatons, and that's very much within the buildings and the transport sectors. You see the other sectors being very small sort of proportions of that mix, really. What you see that's driving this is you have a lot of electric vehicles that are coming into it. You have quite a significant amount of behaviour change happening both across the transport side of things, within sort of industry and within our homes as well. You have a sort of transfer from being predominantly private car use to much more use of the public transport system. Buildings wise, we get ambitious programs around heat pumps and our heat networks, and that's particularly sort of in the 10 years between 2025 and 2035. And then this is common across all the pathways. Massive retrofit of our domestic buildings really is an absolute must here. Power generation, well, we see quite a lot of solar PV, onshore wind being scaled up, as well as the application of carbon capture and storage technology to energy from waste plants. If we move on to the next scenario, which is really around the high hydrogen, so this really is talking about the role of hydrogen and how that helps us get towards where we need to be. So what this gives us is a 76% reduction on today's levels, leaving remaining emissions around 2.7. Again, the buildings, but more so in the transport sector, is where sort of the majority of the emissions remain. What you see here is significant uptake of hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, but particularly for those heavier segments. So you're talking about heavy goods and the buses here, but towards the latter part of the period that we're looking at here, so in the 2030s. You get in buildings a transfer from natural gas use to hydrogen use, and that comes on stream around about 2028 we're talking about here. As with Max Ambition pathway, there's a lot of heat pump installations, but in this case they are hybrid heat pumps, and the same applies as the Max Ambition when it comes to the scale of retrofit that is actually needed. And the same sort of process is happening again on solar PV and on onshore wind and the carbon capture and storage on energy from waste. If we move on to our final scenario, which is around balanced, so this is the Ronseal moment, really. It does what it says on the tin. It is balanced across the scale of technologies that we have here. So you get a 73% reduction on where we start with. 3 megatons of emissions remain there, and that's primarily because instead of what you see within the high hydrogen Max Ambition, where natural gas has completely gone from the mix, you still have some natural gas on is providing heating, those types of things, really. You get a mixture of rollout of technologies in the transport sector. So you're seeing hydrogen fuel cells, you're seeing electric vehicles across all the vehicle types there. And you have industry and you have buildings relying on a mix of electrification or hydrogen. And then again, rollout of PV, onshore wind and energy from waste, carbon capture and storage is in there as well and helping towards the decarbonisation side of things.
No, sorry to interrupt whilst you're mid-flow. I have just circulated the presentation to all the members, just in case that is helpful for everybody to be able to read where you are. So you might want to just let us know what page you're on, and then we can all read as we go.
Thank you, Jackie. Apologies, I didn't realise that facility wouldn't. I wouldn't have that available to me. So thank you. Yes.
Don't worry, we did not know either.
We're on page 8 now for everybody who's following it with the attachment that Jackie sent round. What this is talking about is fuel demand, really. So how it sort of looks when it comes to the different pathways and where we currently are. So you can see how this differs according to which scenario. So as I've sort of talked about, sort of the max ambition is very much around an electrification approach. So that is the dominant sort of fuel use within that pathway, and it uses the least amount of fuel as well, primarily because it's a very efficient way of using that. The hydrogen has a greater amount of fuel use, and that's very much down to a more balanced approach and sort of the need to have hydrogen as well as electrification playing out into that mix. And then the balance is sort of somewhere in between, reflecting that mix of technologies that you actually see. We're on to page 9 now. What this is talking about is just giving you a bit of a comparison of where we are at 2038 through the different pathways. So as you can see from the diagram, at 2030 there's still quite a high level of emissions that are still remaining, and that's very much because of things like uptake of low carbon technologies. We're just in some of the areas at quite an early stage. So to get the stock turnovers that get us to deliver the scale that we need to takes time. And we're not seeing that by 2030. We see it by 2038 as you've had a lot longer to be able to do that. You also see that stock turnover is having an effect on the remaining emissions, because you're still going to have, for instance, diesel and petrol cars running around. The levels of deployment of alternative fueled vehicles is not going to be sufficient to allow us to get all of the diesel and petrol cars out of the mix, and indeed some people may not want to do that. As you can see from the final sort of the graphs on the right there is a little comparison of what the final sort of remaining emissions look like if you had a zero carbon electricity grid. So that drops again to another sort of 0.6 megatons in the instance of the maximum ambition scenario. So just to finish up on this segment, really, if, just to add to the sort of key points that I started with on this, I'll just add a few more into the mix, really, just for context. So reaching net zero in West Yorkshire is quite challenging. It's everywhere, of course it is, but because we're densely populated, plus we have limited land area to do negative emissions technologies, it's quite difficult in West Yorkshire. So we need to be aware of that and aware of the challenge that presents to us. We did, will remember, we did some carbon budgeting work with the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change over in Manchester that set a carbon budget for the Leeds City region. Unfortunately, that work isn't directly comparable with this, because we never calculated a budget for West Yorkshire. So that's an unfortunate result of this work, unfortunately. It'll come as absolutely no surprise to everybody on this call that achieving the levels of emission reduction modelled will require some significant funding and support from government and significant policy change from government too, to help us deliver what we need to do. And with that comes a need for highly ambitious leadership and policy at all levels to be able to deliver this scale of reductions needed. I mentioned one of the challenges, but there are lots of different challenges that we will need to overcome to get us where we need to. You could pick out a whole raft of them, but as a little bit of flavour, that misalignment with national policy timing is one of them. Building up the supply chains, the skills and the infrastructure to allow us to make this transition is obviously another one. And absolutely key to this is going to be the consumer and their awareness and their appetite for change and acceptance of the measures that have been that will need to happen. We can't do this alone. This has to be part of a collective of coming together of the coalition that we put together back in the middle of last year as part of this climate emergency declaration. So everybody needs to come together to deliver that. And just to finish up here, while we're not selecting a particular pathway at the moment, there is absolutely some common activity that spans all of these pathways that I've talked about, which we can focus on in the shorter term, because there is no risk to us for looking at those areas because they are common across all the pieces. So I think at that point, it's probably a good point for me to just pause and take any questions that might have arisen as a result of sort of just quickly going through the key findings there.
That's great, Noel. Thank you. Really good summary. And I'm assuming that as people are digesting the slides that have just gone round as well, there may be more questions that come later on, so we can come back to this in a bit. One thing that sort of occurred to me, and it may have occurred to others as well, is that we're focusing on the conclusions here, but not necessarily seeing all of the analysis that sits beneath it at the moment. Mm-hmm. So I imagine, and I'm asking for a sort of show of thumbs or similar, that people might value seeing the underpinning analysis. If that's the case, we can circulate that, I'm assuming.
Absolutely. Just a little bit of a health warning that comes up with this. It is, as you could probably expect, it's quite a technical document, so is over 150 pages long. So just a little bit of health warning on that one.
But we can send it around the panel members, and on a kind of by exception sort of way that if people choose to read it, they can. If they don't, there's lots of thumbs popping up here. So so that feels like a yes. No obligation to read it, folks. If lockdown,
please do. We'd be welcome for your feedback.
If insomnia is kicking in too hard, that's fine as well. Okay, but yeah, I think that would be a good bit of transparency in terms of supporting the ask that we have of the panel today, just to give them that opportunity to dig in, because there are quite a few people here who like the detail. So I think perhaps inadvertently I may have just addressed your question, Scott, Councillor Patient. What documents will consultees receive? No, sorry, that's an unrelated point. This is linking through to questions that relate to when the consultation process is going to start and what documents will be supporting that. I think perhaps you can do yourself more justice than I've just done you, Scott. Can you ask your own question? Is that okay?
Sorry, yeah, Scott's fine. No one calls me councillor, by the way. So let me have a look. Sorry, I'm gonna have to go back to it now because I've realised I put loads of stuff there. I just asked the question about will the report include preferred pathway or scenario pathways? When are the actual pathways going to be produced and made available? And also a little bit about when will that stakeholder engagement begin and what will that look like? And I just followed up by sort of saying, what documentation will the consultees receive? And then my final addendum there at the bottom, which is my final bit, I promise you, is are the pathways provided for each of the individual emission segments, so transport and domestic and business and all the other bits, like how's that been worked out? So sorry, a bit of a pile on there.
Not a problem.
Thanks, Scott.
I wonder, Simon, if it would be worthwhile just pausing on those questions until sort of my final segment on this, which is around the engagement side of things. And some of those questions might come out naturally as I sort of go through the timescales that we're talking about and the documents that we're going to use.
That makes an awful lot of sense. It really does. And I think also we've got a technical question there from Richard about the hydrogen and carbon capture related technologies. There are some fairly big outliers to these scenarios, aren't there? So perhaps it'd be useful to pick those up. They're both positive and negative. So we're starting from baseline as it stands. We're not starting from an assumption that might have other decisions and layer more carbon into the mix that we then have to deal with later on, nor are we anticipating technologies that are way beyond current expectation. I think those things are true, are they not?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah.
So I think there's probably a question that relates to Richard's and also picks up on Scott's one about pathways and so on that sort of links those two things together, where we've got stuff in the credit and the debit side of the column. So why don't you, as long as, in fact, let me just open it up and anybody can just shout in at this point, because I can't really manage these questions anymore. They're all blending together. So unless anybody shouts up, we are going to hand back to Noel and Jackie and let them crack on with the paper. But I'm going to pause briefly and I shall take silence as acquiescence. That counts. Off you go, Noel.
Thanks, Simon. So for everybody who's following it on the presentation, I'm on to page 12 now. So what I wanted to do was I've run through quite quickly sort of the high level, this is what the pathways are sort of saying. But what I wanted to now do was just give you a little bit of a more deeper dive, not too much, I'll add, into what each of the sectors is sort of saying from the point of view of the measures that need to be applied, the percentages, reductions, those types of things, really. So if we start on transport, which again is page 12, the first thing I sort of wanted to say really on that is cars, vans, heavy goods vehicles are still going to be the predominant transport emissions in 2038. They will still contribute, but it will be a much smaller proportion of where it was. You know, there is an element of this that as road transport sort of decarbonises, non-road transport, so aviation, rail elements start to increase a little bit more. So you see sort of those non-road transport sources becoming a bigger slice of the pie when we get to 2038. As will come no surprise, the maximum ambition scenario delivers the largest amount of savings, but is very much needing to see some really hard and fast behaviour change happening, and a real push on the deployment of low carbon sort of low emission vehicles here. So as I said when I was describing the max ambition scenario, this is really about going as hard and fast as we really can on this. What the maximum ambition scenario sort of telling us here is 2030, that's when we should be trying to end the sales of petrol and diesel cars. Obviously, that's much more in advance of central government. Is current thinking on that. That might come to 2035, but in 2030. So that's the scale of sort of things that we're talking about. That's maybe one we need to consider about is a lobbying piece for central government. What we're looking at when it comes to the deployment of zero emission vehicles is under balanced and under the high hydrogen scenarios. What you're seeing here is sales of around 40,000 cars needed per year. That rises to 50,000 if we're talking about the maximum ambition scenario. So that's the scale of sales that we need to see to try and deliver the emissions reductions that we see through private car use. To put that into context as well, private car use is going to go down. I think I mentioned it in that you see roughly the same amount of distance travelled happening in 2038, the modes just change quite significantly. You see private car use dropping off, but that sort of percentage drop that you see from a private car side of things is picked up by the public transport system or active travel, primarily cycling and walking in that respect. You see increases in heavy goods vehicles as well, sales when it comes to low emissions side of that. As you can see there on point 7, you see quite a significant reduction in private car use, as I've said. So 43% reduction by 2030 under the max ambition. You see 24% only needed under the high hydrogen balance. So slight differences on that side of things. Journey shift to active and public transport is going to be fundamental to this. You see huge increases in walking and especially cycling in this respect. I think the big sort of headliner on cycling is a 20-fold increase on where we are today for journeys. So it's a massive one really to take away really for that.
No, do you want to just sort of, for the benefit of those present, just reflect back on what the previous assumptions were in terms of uptake? Because I think it was about 300% uptake versus 2,000%, wasn't it?
Yeah, so I think walking, do you mean in regard to walking and cycling side of things?
Yeah, active transport, yeah.
Yeah, so I think we're talking about an increase of about 78% when it comes to the walking side of things, but it is over 2,000% increase when it comes to the cycling. I think you're talking about coming from a base of, I think it's 119 million kilometres that are currently travelled by cycling within West Yorkshire. That needs to rise to around 2.5 billion by 2038 when it comes to cycling. So really quite stark in that respect.
Can I just come in on that, Chair, really quickly? So the point you're I think referring to is that in the current transport strategy for West Yorkshire, which was published about 3 years ago, it talks about a 300% increase in cycling and walking. And what this is indicating, which we've known for a while, is that that needs to be much more ambitious, and effectively that target needs to go up to 2,000%.
That is exactly the point I was lumbering towards that you articulated properly. Thank you, Alan. Absolutely right. Thank you.
And just to finish up on the transport side of things, so what you'll see here is we need to see an increase in rail passenger capacity and rail freight capacity as well. The network can take some of that at the moment, but there will need to be infrastructure improvements to allow that fully to happen. So electrification plays a really key part from a rail perspective in the decarbonisation journey. I'll next move on to the buildings side of things. So what you see here is in 2038, the majority of our remaining emissions are in the building sector from electricity use. And that's basically electricity use at non-zero carbon intensity. We don't think the grid's going to get to a point where it is zero carbon in 2038. What we need to see in the building sector, and I alluded to it a little bit earlier, is we need to see a retrofit of 679,000 homes. So to put that into context, West Yorkshire has just over 1 million homes. So you're talking about a significant energy efficiency drive across West Yorkshire that is needed. That's across all the pathways. That is common to all of them. And then there needs to be the installation of low carbon heating systems, and that varies across the pathways depending on what fuel source you're looking at. So if you think about the maximum ambition scenario, what that's talking about is needing 665,000 heat pumps to be installed by 2038. To put that into context, we have less than 1,800 installed within West Yorkshire at this moment in time. You'll get in uptake of district heating in urban areas. From a hydrogen perspective, what you see is hydrogen being driven for heat. So you get to a point where we need to have seen 515,000 hydrogen boilers to be installed into homes, and also for 27% of non-domestic heat to be supplied by hydrogen as well. I should have mentioned when it came to the max ambition one, 47% of non-domestic heat would be served by heat pumps. So just to sort of put those two again into context. what you would see is the hydrogen uptake would be slower and wouldn't really kick off until 2028, which is what we've made the assumption as being realistic from the point of view of hydrogen coming on stream. But from there, it would accelerate really quite quickly to deliver those that 515,000 hydrogen boilers. Heat pump side of things are needed within the high hydrogen scenario as well, but from a hybrid heat pump perspective, so combined with either biomass, bioenergy boilers, or more likely the hydrogen boilers, that side of things. And then the balance side of things sees a mixture of both heat pumps and hydrogen being installed, with district heating as well, filling in the sort of the gaps as well. If we move on to, page 14, which is around the power sector. So this is basically talking about where we are now from the point of view where our emissions arise. So it's very much from our energy from waste plants and our small fossil fuel generators. So these are very sort of small scale, could be gas plants, those types of things. So they'll still exist in the sort of mix going into 2038, but that'll be combined with solar, onshore wind, energy from waste, but energy from waste with carbon capture and storage in there. That's likely to be the dominance when it comes to the sector in 2038. So I talked about carbon capture and storage. It's going to be a key technology, not just for the power sector and on energy from waste plants, but it's going to be useful, quite important from an industry perspective, and I'll talk about in the next bit. Renewable energy capacity increases. So we're talking about significant deployment of solar PV and onshore wind capacities every year. Up to 2030 under the max ambition, but obviously up to 2038 in the others. Max ambition has the largest amounts of deployment, whereas the other scenarios are a little bit more reduced. We're not an island, so we haven't got a cat in hell's chance to try and generate enough electricity to cover off the demands that we have as a region. So we will still be reliant on importing quite a lot of that electricity from the national grid. So it hovers around about 79 to 81% of our electricity will need to be drawn from the national grid. It's not necessarily an issue. And there will need to be some work to try and stimulate and incentivize carbon capture and storage being implemented, and how it links into a wider sort of regional maybe system of carbon transportation, whether that's into the sort of Humber, where I know that they are sort of really looking at in quite a lot of detail. Industry, I'm coming to the end, so don't worry. We have limited heavy industry here. So as I sort of set out at the start, it's very much around glass, it's around chemicals and food and drink industry. What you're sort of seeing here is fuel switching having to happen, energy and resource efficiency having to happen. But a key area for industry is going to be trying to help and provide the support for industry to transition to these low carbon fuels. At the moment, there's a massive gap from the point of view of enough equipment that can industrial equipment that can actually handle low carbon fuels, whether that hydrogen, whether that bioenergy, or whether it's electricity. So there's quite a bit of research, development and demonstration ability that is actually needed from an industrial perspective on that side of things. Carbon capture and storage feeds into the picture again, because to get some of these sectors down to net zero, we will need some kind of carbon capture storage, and it will again need to be thought of within the infrastructure requirements that are needed for that as well. And then on to page 16, which is around land use and agriculture. So this is a very small part of the picture within West Yorkshire, and what we're likely to see is a little bit of an increase in our land use emissions. Emissions across the sector, sorry, and that's very much because of urban expansion that we're expecting to happen within West Yorkshire, in line with sort of population growth, those types of things. They're sort of assumptions that are built into the modelling. Where we see big reductions on that side of things is around peatland restorations, around bioenergy crops, around tree planting as well. So we're talking about 183 hectares increase in tree planting within West Yorkshire. We're also thinking about, within the context of this, diet change, so transition away from meat and dairy products to a more sort of vegetable-based sort of diet and those types of things. Simon's come in, so I'm getting the wink that I should be wrapping up, and I have on that side of things. So I'll pause again and yeah, up to you for questions.
Thank you, Nell. No, that was a fairly unsubtle way, wasn't it? No bother, thank you. That's great. Okay, so what I'm going to invite everybody to do is go cameras back on, and we'll just have a free discussion at this point. Use the chat, if you will, to identify any bids for time in terms of any other business. I'm going to assume there is none unless you signal that there is. If there is, make sure I'm aware of it and just type me a message. So there have been a couple of things that have been linked together that relate to transport. One that came in from Leah, talking about the changes that really are embedding themselves into society in terms of the way that we travel, the way that we commute, the way that we work, and really understanding the models and how adaptable they are. I'm just paraphrasing your question, I think, here, Leah, to to anticipate a future with less journey density around work, perhaps around studying and other ways of living. And there's a vaguely connected point that came from Scott that talks about the potential for submitting our work to the DFT's decarbonising transport consultation. So whilst people are thinking about what they would like to address, and they will signal to me hopefully with a wave or a real wave or a virtual thumbs up or something of that nature, would you like to, or you or Alan or Jackie, like to just reflect briefly on those transport related questions for us?
Should I go? So from the point of view of the DFT consultation, I think there's absolutely an opportunity to do that. One of the things that we wanted to do within our engagement approach is actually to engage with those government departments which some of these measures directly relate to. So absolutely, there is an opportunity to do that. Part of the work also will identify areas where we should be looking to lobby central government. So again, that represents a really good opportunity to sort of feed into that side of things. Just on the opportunities to sort of change the assumptions that we mentioned there as well. So at the end of the process, we get the model that has actually been developed as part of this work. So there will be functionality within it to actually change some of the assumptions and the data that's actually gone into this. So we hopefully will be in a position where we can hand this over to our research and intelligence department to be able to sort of run it again and change some of the figures in it as and when we see fit. Obviously, that doesn't really help within the context of where we've been at the moment from the point of view of the pandemic. So our consultants will be in the final product that we get back, be giving us a narrative on where it is we think there will be improvements that could achieve additional emission savings. So we'll get that sort of narrative. It won't actually be playing out within the model itself, unfortunately.
Okay, fair enough. Leah, I probably mangled your question. Do you want to come in on that at all, or are you okay? You're okay? Okay. So, who else wants to come in? Ask a question, make a comment, pose a challenge. My word.
Stunned silence.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, Sarah, would you like to?
Yeah, it's I sent one through on the chat, and it's around the financial support for households with retrofit. We're talking a considerable large amounts of money, but a lot of the retrofit homes are the ones that are harder to treat, and it's just around an ask of government for support for those retrofit projects, because it will be some considerable amount of money and there won't be easy projects to deliver.
I think there is the opportunity in the sort of next steps on this to really dig into the detail around what that retrofit program sort of should look like, what are the policies and actions that need to be implemented, and within that we can look at, you know, what are the lobbying positions to central government that we need to talk about, and we can include those types of things within that. You know, this isn't me, this isn't the combined authority coming up, this is partners shaping what comes forward out of this work. So you know, encourage.
No, do you want me to? Sorry, just to save Noel some words there as well, Councillor. We well, today, in fact, we had a really large meeting with all of our local authority partners in the whole of the kind of North East Yorkshire and Humber on energy efficiency. So there's a huge amount of work. The energy hubs. So again, you remember we brought you back a paper last time on the work of the energy hubs, but that's their #1 priority going forward, and we've secured some money. So that work actually doesn't need to necessarily wait for this next phase that we're talking about. There's work already starting on that, and again, we can't say quite at this point, but the idea is that we will create an energy efficiency pipeline for the whole of the North East, Yorkshire and Humber, in light of and readiness for hopefully the 9 billion from the manifesto commitment. But we are led to believe that, you know, hopefully some of that will come very quickly. So we'll be ready for that.
Super, thanks, Jackie. Andrew, I know I've just spotted on the chat there you'd like to come in and build on the retrofit issue. So over to you.
Yeah, it was just to follow up on the question from Councillor Ferriby about the cost. There's a certain project within York which has generated some comment. I think just looking back at previous projects, the Leeds Region Homes and Communities Agency, when it existed, had the DEEP project, which was a long-term investment in hard to treat properties such as pre-1919 terraces, single brick, and the things that don't have the cavity walls which have readily been filled. It's really looking at the scale of the numbers of houses, and therefore having a 10-year program linking in with construction techniques, training, and really giving it a good go to get through tens of thousands of properties within the city region and further afield.
Just to give you some reassurance, Councillor, the work that we're hoping to do at the hub includes all the supply chains and supporting the construction industry.
Great, thank you. My pause is me just dragging through the group chat. Okay, so pending the technical report that's going to come around in all of its 150 pages of glory, and recognising that we've had a chance to feed into certain other discussions recently, both through the economic recovery session that we had and through the call for response around the airport and various other things. So those discussions and those perspectives have already been shared, so we don't need to reiterate here, I don't think. Are we content? Do we have any other observations or questions or challenges, or shall we move on to the limited AOB that we have? I'm just going to look for. Tell you what, people can switch, either sort of show me a signal or switch your cameras off, or do something that will give me a sense that you are happy to move on. Oh, look at that, that's very 2020, isn't it? That's marvellous. Okay. Super. Okay, thank you everybody, and thank you Noel for taking us through a and Alan, I can see, is that a I am content or I want to come in? I think it's I want to come in.
Well, is it okay if I just come in and say something, given that?
Please do, yeah, absolutely.
Given the endorsement by silence, which is that this is not a side project. This is absolutely central to the LEP and the CA agenda going forward. And as we develop all of the plans around economic recovery, skills, housing, business support, transport, etc. It all needs to be geared towards delivering the pathways that are set out in this document. So it's a really, really, really crucial moment when the CA signs this off, assuming that the panel agrees to put it forward to the CA, of course, in a minute. And I just wanted to make sure that people were aware of that. So issues that I like the one I mentioned a minute ago, where about the cycling and walking target, the CA's ambitions in that space will need to be geared towards delivering the targets that are set out within these pathways. No less ambitious than that.
And that links back to the economic recovery discussion we had before, and the fact that this is a fundamental, it is a frame of reference or a foundational point rather than a priority now. And so I think, reflecting that discussion and the minutes that relate to it, it's important to revisit it. So thank you for that. And actually, for the benefit of others, can we just quickly rehearse the timeline, because clearly we're asking for endorsement, and we're getting that through this call, but we're also about to send a substantial document, and there may be certain questions that come from that. So what is, when is the CA meeting that will press the button on this one, Alan?
It's the 27th of July. 24th or 27th of July?
27th, Alan.
27th of July.
Okay, so Noel, if we can circulate the documents to which we've referred, the slides have gone around, the technical document will go around as well. So let's give people to sort of this time next week to respond to Jackie and I, just in sort of open CC email with any comments that they might have. In the absence of those, we'll endorse and go ahead on the basis described, I think. Does that sound okay? Jackie? Yeah? No?
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely.
I don't want to drop anybody in anything here, but I'm assuming that's the case. Okay, great. Right, so we have a few minutes left, and we have decided to take the major projects update as read, with no meaningful presentation on that. So I'm just going to create a bit of space now. Again, silence as suggestion we progress. Are there any questions? Is there anything anybody would like to ask about that? So on that basis, we have one bit of time on AOB, and we have about 4 or 5 minutes left. So Rosa, would you like to come in with your additional item? And if I think we probably have time for at least one more, if there is another one. If there isn't, we'll wrap the meeting up a few minutes ahead of time. But Rosa, come on in with your AOB, please.
Thank you. So the AOB is really short, so I'm going to steal a minute from my own AOB to say I feel like the end of that discussion has been a bit flat. I just want to say that actually the work that you guys have done on that emissions pathway to get it to where it is phenomenal. So this sort of the silent thumbs up or turn off your video thing is kind of really belies the amount of work, and certainly my own personal respect and enthusiasm for it. So I want to see the technical report, partly for my own learning, but also so I can share it, promote it across the Environment Agency nationally with my partners. So that's why I'm asking for that. So just to share, guys.
That's a really good point. Thank you. You're right. It was about the most anticlimactic way we could it really was. So can we just let the minutes reflect our thanks to all those who've been involved and our recognition of the efforts that have gone into a sterling piece of work.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so then the brief AOB was at the workshop that we had last week. I mentioned that I had a call with some Arts Council representatives, Heritage England, Heritage Lottery Fund colleagues across the north who are developing a piece of work with MP11 on the MP11's place strategy. and how heritage, arts, culture and the environment feed in into that. I haven't got the slide deck yet, but when we've got a draft slide deck ready to share, so it's building on work that the IPPR North have done around this for the MP11. I will share it round. I imagine Alan, Jackie, Noel, Karen is embedded within the combined authority, so you'll be familiar to it. But I think it's important. It's really important work, and it's really important that we socialise it. It is focused on place. Our last discussion ended up walking into skills very, very heavily, and how we utilise those skills to talk and promote the climate emergency to get the behaviour changes that we're talking about here. So I think there is a lot of crossover in it as well. So although it has the tag heritage, arts and culture and environment, it really is a lot broader. So I'm keen when it's ready to socialise that we do that. That was it.
Great, thank you. And I think that links back to one of the points that Ben was making earlier on about really, connecting into that arts community in a way in which we can really learn from and benefit from, and use them both as an enabler for our engagement, but also provide support to them, and fully endorsed and supported. Thank you, Rosa. Okay, so just oh gosh, I'm not feeling really self-conscious, which is slightly unusual for me. But in the absence of any sort of waves or flags or anything that might indicate another AOB, I'm going to hand back to Jackie just to check I've not missed anything, Jackie. But otherwise, just say, look, thank you very much for your time and your focus. It's been a really important meeting. It's good to be back together again and out in the public domain. So hopefully people have been, engaging with us as well via YouTube. And once the technical document has come around, if you wish, please read it and feed any comments or thoughts in, and then we'll consolidate those and go ahead well in advance of the Combined Authority meeting, Alan. So thank you for your time, much appreciated. Have a good rest of the evening.
So,
bye.
Thanks, Simon. Brilliant.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.